Fae Wilds, Book 4, Crown and Glory, written by wjmay, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 14. Solomon swung his hammer with a ferocity that engendered admiration, but the centipedes were quick, writhing to avoid the blows while climbing closer. Gilly let out a scream when one clambered up the back side of the rock to snap at her ankles. She leapt onto Solomon's back, but she couldn't avoid the giant insect and its hungry maw. Gilly struggled, barely holding herself up, when her hand gripped a sheath tucked under Solomon's shirt. Quick as she could, she shoved her hand into his shirt and pulled out the dagger that was tucked there. Equipped for the fight, she turned and slashed at the centipede as it started to raise itself toward her. She managed to make contact, and the creature squealed in anger. Dropping to her feet again, Gilly fought with determination, seeking the soft spots in its segmented exoskeleton. She jabbed it repeatedly, black blood covering her blade, before she'd weakened it enough to kick it off the rock entirely. Others followed, and together with her companions she battled them, using her dagger with deadly accuracy. Soon there were only 2 centipedes left, scrabbling down the corpses of their fellow creatures to scurry off in defeat. Gilly was panting, covered in the black ichor that was their blood. She lowered herself to the ground, avoiding the corpses, and took a few steps before falling to her knees in the dust, exhausted. Solomon came after her, holding his hand out for his dagger. His face held a look of surprise mixed with appreciation. "You are quite impressive with that blade, which is why I'll have to ask for it back now." "I'd prefer to keep it," she replied. "It seems every other second there is a new danger to contend with. Raiders, sandstorms, centipedes. What's next? What else will try to annihilate us?" "Well, you are in a hell realm," he pointed out with a grin, as if she hadn't already become intimately acquainted with that fact. "This is situation normal." "Don't you dare say, 'What did you expect?'" Gilly glared up at him, her features tight with anger. "I'm not in the mood for your little cracks today. I'm bone-tired and covered in centipede blood." "It could be a good look for you," he said, attempting to keep a straight face. "Black suits you." "And a lifetime in a Fae prison suits you," she spat back, making him laugh. "You can keep the blade for now, but if I catch you attempting to stab it into my back, I won't be pleased. As much as I'm enjoying our banter, I think we should get moving. The centipedes could come back with reinforcements." His words had her on her feet in seconds, her eyes fixed on the rock formations in the distance. Without speaking, she turned on her heel and continued on in the direction they'd been headed. After a few moments, Solomon spoke again. "Who taught you to fight like that?" he asked quietly. Gilly debated continuing the silent treatment, but the endless walking was already boring enough without conversation. She shrugged. "I did, I guess, with some help from the wildlings who guard the wilds, but I'm the fastest of them all. At least I used to be before this leafing iron stunted my abilities." "I would like to see you at full power," he murmured. "I bet you're a force to be reckoned with." "Take off the iron and find out," she dared him. For a moment a look crossed his face, one that said he was considering it, but it passed as quickly as it had come. "You may just be the most valuable possession to come into my hands in my long and miserable life." His tone said he was anything but miserable. Gilly figured it was a compliment of sorts and turned to find him watching her. "How long of a miserable life have you had?" "I'm 500 years old, give or take." Gilly paused, turning to him with wide eyes. 500 years old? You don't act a day over 12. Solomon laughed. "There's the sharp Fae tongue I was waiting for. I knew I could cheer you up." Letting out a burst of frustrated air, Gilly shook her head. "Just when I think he's the worst brute alive, he does something to try and cheer me up." "Why do you keep bothering to try and jolly me along? It seems like extra effort considering I'm a slave." A frown marred his perfect features, but was rapidly pasted over by his usual arrogant grin. "And a valuable one. As I just said, I'm hoping to succeed in making you smile." "And what good does a smile from me do you?" she asked, paying close attention to his answer. Some emotion rose up inside her, something without a name, but it made her hang on his every word and gesture. His expression was, for a moment, serious, and Gilly thought he might be on the verge of revealing something. Then he answered her question. All that scowling will wrinkle your face." Gilly's insides filled with disappointment. I should have known better. She turned away from him, deciding she'd been a fool not to go with the silent treatment. I won't make that mistake again. "We will make for that low ridge," Solomon said, speaking for the first time in over an hour. "I've made camp there before. We should be safe." "Don't promise what you can't guarantee," Gilly wanted to say, but she was still holding her tongue. She followed him to the ridge and climbed up it with him, stopping when he did. There was a shallow outcropping that created a natural shelter, and Solomon set his pack down there. "A fire here should stay unobserved, thanks to the rocks around us," he said quietly. Gilly watched while Solomon gathered a few stones from around them and arranged them in a small circle. Then he held his hands over them, and the stones began to glow orange. She felt the heat radiating off them, which was appreciated as the light was dying and the chill of night in the desert was approaching. "Sit tight here," he told her. "I'm going to find us something fresh for dinner." She met his eyes, and they held hers. "Don't try to run, because chances are something worse than me will find you. Keep that blade handy, in case you need to use it." She watched him go, considering flinging it into his back exactly as he had warned her against, but left the blade in her boot, figuring she might need to use it on some other monster of the desert. The stars began to dot the sky as one sun was beyond the horizon, and the other was hovering just above it. Gilly's eyes soon became heavy with sleep, and she dozed until Solomon returned, this time bearing gifts. The meat of an unknown animal was flung onto the rocks, jolting her awake. It sizzled, heating up quickly as Solomon bent to lay out the rest of his spread. "I managed to find some fresh onions and a few breadfruit," he said, breaking some twigs off a nearby scraggly bush. Gilly watched as he cut into the items and shoved them onto the sticks, shoving the ends of the sticks into the ground so that the onions and breadfruits hovered over the smoking meat. "Here," he said, passing her a few bright red berries. "I don't know how the birds missed these. They'll make a nice pre-dinner treat." Gilly took the berries and placed one on her tongue. A light sweetness filled her mouth as she bit down. They tasted almost as sweet as the cloudberries that grew in the tops of the trees in her own forest home. "I could eat an entire bowl of these and ask for more." "Then take the rest," he said, dumping them into her cupped hands. Solomon turned his attention to the meat, flipping it over and digging out a knife. While it cooked, he began cutting it into bite-sized pieces. "What is that?" Gilly asked, pointing at the meat. "You'd rather not know," he answered. "So let's call it desert rabbit." Gilly's forehead was marred by a wrinkle. She considered what it might be, then decided he was correct. "I don't want to know." Solomon stabbed into a piece and popped it into his mouth, letting out a sound of appreciation. When he held a piece out to her, she leaned in to bite it off the edge of his knife, not wanting to dirty her hands. His eyes followed her as she chewed, then he held out another bite. Again she took it off his knife, and when her eyes met his, she found a look of hunger in them, one that didn't seem directed at the meat, but at her instead. They ate in silence, both from the edge of his knife. Before long, her belly was full and her body was warm. Instead of winding her up tighter, the ease between them was allowing Gilly to relax. She tried not to think about what that meant. "I've got something else for you," Solomon said, moving away from the makeshift fire and into the darkness. He returned moments later, carrying something. He unfolded it to reveal a fur pelt that was bigger than he was. Gilly could not tell what kind of animal it had come from, but when he laid it on the ground near the fire, she leaned in to touch it, finding the fur as soft as a rabbit's. It belonged to the creature I just ate, she realized. But she didn't let that thought deter her. Gilly moved onto the pelt, relishing the softness after the dust and rocks she'd been sitting on. Solomon took his place beside her, the corners of his mouth turning up. "There's the smile I've been looking for," he said softly, and Gilly realized that she was, in fact, smiling. "Thank you for the fur and the meal," she said, meaning it. "Creature comforts make all the difference," he said, and for a moment his face took on a faraway look, the ghost of suffering passing over his handsome features. Gilly wondered when he'd gone without such comforts, a part of her feeling sympathy for him. Despite his determination to sell her off, Gilly had to admit that he wasn't all bad. In fact, she was certain that, Another captain might have treated her much worse than this. Living in the wilds, we depend on the forest to give us what we need, but sometimes long winters bring frost that kills the fruits, roots, and nuts we depend on, or a too hot summer results in fires that burn away our homes. It's not an easy life, so when the forest presents us with a blessing, we take it. Solomon watched her face as she spoke, nodding along. She trained her eyes on his, shining out of the shadows that hid most of his expression. Hell offers up few blessings, but sometimes it can surprise you. She felt his finger under her chin, lifting her face. He bent in until he was inches from her. Like you, would you, sir? He's going to kiss me. She felt it, felt the electricity humming between them. Solomon's lips crept closer, and she stared at them, wondering what they would feel like pressed against her own. At the last moment, he pulled away, breathing heavily. Lie down, he said, the authority back in his voice. I'll keep watch tonight. But you didn't sleep last night, she was about to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Their near kiss had rattled her too. Gilly lay on the fur and stared up at the stars. Before long, her eyes were starting to droop, thanks to the warmth of the stones and her full belly. Moments later, she fell into a dream. Chapter 15. Lena, is that you? Gilly stood in the shadow of a rock formation, shading her eyes against the twin suns as she squinted to make out a figure in the distance. She could tell this was a dream the moment she stepped into it, and she'd been waiting for Lena to arrive and let her know how the preparations for her rescue were going. But part of her was worried, a tendril of fear working its way up her insides. After last night's nightmarish takeover in which she'd been embraced by some hideous aquatic creature, she was on edge, looking for any hint that her dream wasn't what it seemed. The figure moved forward in a blur, appearing directly in front of her and making Gilly gasp. You! It wasn't her twin sister who had sought her out in the dream tonight, but the enemy who double-crossed her and stolen her away from her Fae home. You have no idea how long it took me to find you, she huffed, then paused, looking up. Well, I suppose you do, as you've probably been pleased to avoid me each night. What are you doing here? Gilly asked angrily. Don't you have another being to betray? Countless, I'm sure, she replied with a wave of her hand. But right now, I'm looking for you. She scanned the area around her. And where exactly have you hidden yourself from me? Nowhere nice from the look of things. I know this is a dream, and I can wake up, Gilly said softly to herself, willing herself to wake. But nothing happened. Nice try, Fae, Willa said with a roll of her eyes. You think I'd appear just so you could wake up and run from me again? It was some work to locate you, but by the sound of things, your sister has been meeting you here. Perhaps she's the one keeping me from locating you. She's smarter than she looks. You might as well go, Gilly said, her temper exploding. I'll never tell you where I am. Good thing I don't need you to, Willa replied. You're on Haraman Abad, one of the 17 hells of Shayatan. Although, how you got here is another question entirely. Her eyes scanning the horizon, she gave a decisive nod. Just stay alive a little longer and I'll track you down. I'm not waiting around for you, Gilly couldn't believe the woman's audacity. I'm going to escape this realm before you have a chance to get close to me, traitor. Willa laughed, and it echoed around the desolation until the laugh became a chorus. It looks like my little gift is still holding you. She ran her finger along the iron choker until Gilly slapped it away. I don't have to put up with this, she told herself. I am in control of my own dreams. With everything in her, Gilly willed the iron away, but the necklace went nowhere. Her eyes lifted to find Willa grinning at her. You'll never escape that thing, she said confidently. The more you want out, the harder it will be to open. I hate you, Gilly hissed, which only made Willa laugh again. But this time an answering laugh sounded, echoing louder than her own and making the dark-haired beauty start. What was that? She asked, then frowned up at the sky as clouds rushed to cover the sun. Gilly felt a wind blow, the darkness closing in around them. She knew that a nightmare was on the way, one that Willa apparently was not in control of. A pair of shining eyes appeared suddenly, and a massive creature stepped out of the shadows of a nearby rock. "I see we have an uninvited guest!" The words came out awkwardly from lips that were crowded with 2 ivory tusks. Willa lifted her hand and jerked it forward, a whip of cracking energy appearing and lashing Solomon. In his monster form, it had little effect besides making him angry. The ground beneath them began to shake, rocks rolling and sliding until Gilly could barely keep her feet. The sorceress, however, was unbothered by a little thing like an earthquake. She levitated, fire spurting from her hands to engulf Solomon. Gilly barely restrained a cry of distress at the dev's disappearance in the flames, wondering if the woman had managed to incinerate him. But the clouds above them started to circle, lightning flashing down. 2 massive shining eyes appeared in the clouds, and the whirlwind kicked up in earnest, taking the shape of a giant, tooth-filled mouth, the tusks again curling out from the maw. The wind whipped Willa up into the sky and into the whirlwind, the mouth closing to swallow her whole. Gilly turned away as the wind died down. She felt an impact on the rock face and turned to see Solomon's massive form marching toward her. Opening her mouth to thank him, she shut it again when he let out a colossal roar. "Yet another creature come to take you from me," he said, his voice guttural. "When will you understand that you are my possession?" "I did not summon her," Gilly insisted, with her hands up and palms out in a bid to calm the beast down. "She's stalking me." Solomon stared down at her from far above, his expression murderous. "You will learn your place, Fae, if I have to teach it to you anew, every single night." With those words, the dream shifted again, rain pelting her from the angry sky. She turned to tell Solomon to stop, but he was no longer there. He'd left her alone to face the deluge. The water took only moments to create rivulets that turned into slides. Half the rock face fell away, and Gilly fell with it and into oblivion. She rubbed bleary eyes, wishing the suns would set again already. It was still morning, but Gilly was exhausted after a night spent fighting one nightmare after another. Willa had kicked things off with a bang, but it was Solomon who had chased her in one form or another until the stars gave way to the dawn. He walked beside her now, his expression like stone, but cracks were appearing. Gilly knew he had to be weary. He'd gotten little sleep since she'd met him, and they'd traveled many miles. They'd barely spoken since they set out today, and the cold shoulder treatment he was giving her was starting to sting. Out of nowhere, Solomon made a sudden announcement. "We've just crossed the barrier into the prince's domain." His dark eyes bored into hers. "If anyone is coming to your rescue, they won't be able to teleport in and ambush me." Gilly wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how much his words upset her. The dev was in a gloating mood, it appeared, because he continued, "By the end of tomorrow, we will reach his keep, and then you won't be my problem any more." The significance of his words sunk into her, pouring over the tiny flame of hope that had kindled inside her at the prospect of rescue. Gilly knew that reaching the prince's keep would mean her chances of rescue were severely diminished. Not only could her sister's rescue team not teleport into the prince's domain, but she was positive the security a Prince of Darkness employed would be more aggressive than the single dev they'd be facing now. "Please, sister, get your behind in gear and rescue me already before you miss your chance." She tried to imagine what her life would be like inside the prince's keep, but her brain refused to contemplate it. Locked in a cage to be treated like an ornament was likely the best she could hope for. And the worst. Gilly shivered despite the heat of the day. "I've got to get this iron off of me." It was the only hope she had, either to escape Solomon for long enough to be rescued or to find her way out of this hellscape. Her fingers scrabbled for purchase yet again, but she could find none. "Maybe I should have asked Rilla if she had a key when she dropped in last night," she thought to herself, her attempt at irony falling flat even when she was her own audience. Then she remembered the sorceress's response when she tried to wish the collar away in her dream. "The more you want out, the harder it will be to open." Could that have been a hint into how the collar worked? Or was it meant to be a figurative and not literal? Gilly couldn't be sure, but at this point, she didn't have the luxury of passing up any opportunity. For the next few hours, Gilly tried to think of a way to apply Willa's cryptic words to her situation and escape the collar. If her words mean what I think they do, then I have to not want the collar to come off. but I don't see how to make that happen when removing it is all I can think about. She tried to ignore the desire to be out of the collar, but repressing the desire to escape wasn't good enough, apparently. There has to be a trick to it, some way of showing that I don't want it off. Gilly considered what that would mean. A life of wearing the iron collar, an existence of weakness and servitude. How could anyone want that? And what would be enough to make me want to give up my freedom? Her eyes flickered to her companion. Solomon was staring off into the distance. Thankfully, he was no longer in his monstrous form, but that didn't dilute the air of menace around him this morning. It was a contrast from his demeanor the night before. He tried to comfort her, even provided a gift of sorts, but Willa's appearance had put an end to his goodwill, perhaps permanently. What if I knew this collar would never come off? What if I was meant to spend eternity by his side? Could I do it? Could I be both subjugated and satisfied? When she focused on what he'd done to her, what he intended to do to her, Gilly only felt a fierce need to remove the collar. She forced those thoughts out of her mind and told herself to concentrate on the small moments of pleasure she'd found with the dev. Pretend you like the man, she told herself. The way he'd looked after her, making sure she ate and slept, even when he stayed up all night, walking or watching over her. The way he'd protected her from enemies, in and out of her dreams. The name he called her, Mujisa. That gave her little shivers whenever she heard it, even though she didn't know what it meant. Probably something annoying, like whiner, she thought, then ignored herself, trying to maintain her positive focus. The way he looks at me sometimes, like he doesn't know what I will say next and he likes it. The way I feel in his arms. The moment when I thought he was going to kiss me. Gilly's lips turned down as the truth hit her like a rock tumbling from the top of a rock formation to hit her standing below. Unleafing believable. I like him. How could this have happened? Chapter 16. You're being ridiculous. How could you like someone like him? Half the time he's a literal monster. Gilly shook her head, attempting to clear it of her wayward thoughts. I don't like Solomon. I hate him for enslaving me and forcing me to march across the desert to be sold. And she would never be comfortable in servitude. She knew that with every fibre of her being. They are meant to be free, and I wouldn't trade that for any man. I wouldn't even trade it for all of them. Gilly let out a heavy sigh, realizing the iron collar wouldn't be coming off any time soon. She was distracted from her self-pity by the feeling of Solomon's hand on her arm. "Watch where you're going," he said, pointing down to a puddle of mud she'd been about to step in. "We're making our way out of the desolation, but this next region is even more dangerous. You should avoid anything that looks like liquid, and step carefully." Gilly looked around, then, realizing the landscape had shifted while she had been lost in thought. The scrub brush was more plentiful, the sand giving way to a thick, loomy dirt, and mud puddles dotted the ground around him. She focused on Solomon's footsteps, taking the same steps he did to avoid whatever perils were waiting for them. They'd gone another hour when a sudden buzz arose, growing louder. Gilly swiveled, seeking the source of the sound, and when she'd found it, she wished she hadn't. "You've got to be kidding me," she groaned, pulling the dagger from her boot and readying herself. Mosquitoes the size of raptors darted toward them in a buzzing cloud. There had to be half a dozen, maybe more, their proboscises bobbing hungrily. "If one of those things buries itself in my skin, it will hurt like a spear entering my flesh. And if all of them surround me, how long until they drain me?" Her thoughts were coming fast and furious, just like the mosquitoes, and Gilly forced herself to focus. One buzzed in her direction, and she slashed at it, managing to damage a wing. Then the insect was batted to the ground and stomped until pulverized by one of Solomon's meaty fists. He transformed without a sound and was now in his 9-foot-tall form, taking on the swarm of mosquitoes with lightning-quick motions. Gilly remained at the ready, ducking behind him and staying on guard while watching him fight. Solomon didn't bother with his hammer. Instead, he used his fist to batter the mosquitoes, punching them out of the air. He pivoted and dodged, his moves all the more impressive because they were coming from what she would consider a bulky and therefore slow form. He's anything but slow, she thought, once again admiring his abilities. The last mosquito came from behind, and Gilly shouted out a warning. Solomon shifted, grabbing the creature with both hands and smashing it into a rock. It lay there, twitching before going still. Gilly smiled at Solomon, excited to have bested yet another danger. "Hell hasn't taken me out yet." Solomon smiled back, then shifted slightly. His grin vanished, his brow furrowing. He looked down, finding himself calf-deep in a puddle of mud that was about 5 feet across. As she watched, he sank deeper, until he was up to his knees in the mud. "He's sinking," Gilly thought, looking around for something she could use to help him fish him out. She hurried over to a bush and began yanking on one of the branches, but her motion slowed when she saw how quickly the mud was working. His thighs already buried, and in moments the mud would be up to his waist. "Pass me the branch," he said, his voice deep. He was reaching for the ground beside him, hoping to use his arms to pull himself out, but every motion only made him sink faster. Gilly let go of the branch and took 2 steps back. His face filled with confusion, then a black look took over. "Don't you dare!" She had to dare. This might be my only chance to escape him. Adrenaline poured into her, making her shake. "I'm sorry," she mouthed, then turned and ran. Gilly kept her eyes on the ground, not wanting to end up in the same predicament as her captor had. "He'll be okay," she told herself. "He's too strong to be taken out by some mud. But hopefully it will slow him down enough for me to make it out of the swamp and far away from the prince's keep." She walked for hours, moving as rapidly as she was able through the swampland, careful to avoid any missteps. Gilly hoped she was heading back in the direction they'd come, but the area around her all looked the same, and it was impossible to be certain that she was on the right path. A buzz sounded in the distance, and looking back over her shoulder, she saw another swarm begin to form. A vision of Solomon being attacked by the vicious mosquitoes while sinking in the mud made her queasy, so she forced herself to concentrate on her own escape. Guilt was a weight on her own shoulders, another collar to slow her down, and she fought against it, struggling to clear her mind. "I'll find Phaedra and Holly," she told herself to keep her mind off the man she'd abandoned. "We can find our way off this world together." She knew it wasn't going to be easy to locate the winged Fae and her human companion, but it was the best hope she had for escaping the hell world. Maybe Phaedra knows how to take this leafing collar off too. She heard the snap of a branch and froze, ducking just in time to avoid the whipping branches of one of the tortured-looking trees that had dotted the landscape since the desolation. Eyes wide, she saw it sway back into position, then shiver, branches crackling. "Even the trees are killers here," she thought, frowning. Gilly had strayed too close, and one of them had attempted to strike her. Backing up from the tree, she kept her eyes open for threats. She was forced to slow down, knowing that anything and everything in the world around her might be about to attack her. The swamp grew thicker, and she wondered again whether she'd made the correct choice direction-wise. She clearly hadn't, she realized, when she found herself on the edge of a giant marsh with sticky green waters and yellow grass rising around the edges. Gilly wasn't certain how she'd gotten turned around, but there was something about the lake that spooked her. A chorus of croaks emerged, echoing around the lake, and she moved farther away from it, the vision of the amphibian figure who'd clutched at her in her nightmare filling her mind. "The last thing I need is a gang of those things at my back." But moving away from the lake meant entering a thicket of anemic trees. They were yellow like the grasses, although Gilly spotted a few of the tortured trees among them. She stalled, trying to decide whether to risk circling the lake or into the trees. The sound of hooves coming from the grove made the decision for her, and Gilly hurried back toward the lake, trying to avoid whatever was making the noise. Skirting closer to the lake, the moist ground squelched under her boots. Yellow grass grew in clumps that were tighter and more prevalent the farther she walked. Her mind started to betray her, worrying about what the grass could conceal. It reached above her waist in some places, more than long enough to hide many types of unknown creatures, all bent on her destruction. Regret floated in her chest, and Gilly was beginning to wonder if maybe it wasn't as wise as she thought to leave Solomon behind. Lena told me to stay close to him, and here I am, fleeing through a deadly swamp without protection. She stopped short of reminding herself that Solomon himself might be dead, pulled under the mud, but the guilt was unescapable. Gilly hated his behavior and his goal of making a fortune off enslaving her to some powerful but corrupt prince who had an in with the devil himself. but she was also afraid that her actions had led to Solomon's demise, and already she was unsure if she'd be able to forgive herself. "Worry about forgiveness when you've escaped this barbarous place," she told herself, attempting to purge her negative emotions. The sound of pebbles tumbling into the lake made her pause and look behind her. Ultra-sensitive Fae ears could pick up sounds most creatures missed, and Gilly strained to hear something following the sound, but nothing was forthcoming. "It's nothing," she said, continuing her conversation with herself. "Swamps are busy places. It was probably some creature looking for a meal in the lake." Eyeing the lake, Gilly knew in her heart she'd never touch anything that came from beneath its nauseating green-grey waters. A twig snapped behind her, and this time Gilly put on a burst of speed. One sound could be anything, but two means I'm being followed. Speeding as quickly as the terrain and her iron collar would allow, she made it around a curve in the lake, only to see that a section of the grove grew closer to the lake in the area in front of her. None of the tortured trees were visible, but that didn't mean something else might not be lurking. Glancing over her shoulder, she debated whether to turn back and try another way past the lake. "I've gone too far now, and if I want to make it out of this swamp, I can't run away at every little noise, every little tree." With a deep breath, she strode toward the yellow trees. The sun's light was barely muted by the shriveled leaves and sulking branches, but there were enough shadows to make Gilly wary. Her eyes flicked from tree to tree, her tension climbing. Although she could see nothing, something inside her told that she was not alone. A few steps forward, her instincts were worn out, as from out of nowhere a net dropped onto her, catching her off guard. Gilly hurried to claw her way out of it, but the net was large and difficult to clear. Then she heard the hooves pounding in her direction. Struggling harder, she'd almost managed to reach the edge of the net when a shadow covered her. Gilly turned to find a being staring at her, a crossbow at the ready in its hand. She'd escaped the man on horseback, but this was a man with a horse's back instead. The centaur was taller than a normal man, with the head, arms, and torso of a human. The remainder of his body had the form of a chestnut-brown horse. He sniffed at the air, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Release me," Gilly ordered, but the centaur ignored her. He stowed his crossbow and hurried to the net, quickly and efficiently securing her. A moment later, he tossed her onto his back, keeping the net tight in his hand, and set off through the trees. Chapter 17. The day's heat had nearly subsided into twilight by the time they reached a small hill that rose above from the stream they'd been following. Its water was the same green of the lake they'd left behind hours ago. The nearly bare trees had given way to hardier ones with grey-black needles which the centaur weaved through now, headed toward the hill. He'd said nothing in the hours they'd spent together, content to carry his prey in silence. For her part, Gilly had been vocal, demanding her release and struggling to escape the net. But no matter how many times she tried to push herself from his back and reach the ground, he'd caught her and foiled her plan. The centaur came to stop in front of a patch of wilting grass, scrub brush, and dry brown vines that looked much like the rest of the hill, but she discovered it hid the entrance to his dwelling. Bringing her inside through the vines, the creature lifted the net off his back and placed it on the moss-covered stone floor. Gilly scrambled to release herself, then climbed to her feet. Snatching the dagger from her boot, she brandished it at her captor. "Whoa, wee creature!" The centaur held his hands up, keeping still except for the swish of his horse-like tail. "I'm not going to harm ye." This was the first good look she'd gotten at its face. The centaur's ruddy cheeks and carrot-red hair and beard matched the chestnut hair of his lower half. His eyes were light brown, and they held a sincerity that gave her pause. "What do you want from me, then? Why catch me up in a net and haul me all the way here?" "I'm sorry about that," he said, scratching his beard with a chagrined expression. "I couldn't be sure that you were the wee girl that ye appeared to be." His answer took her aback, but her hesitation was short-lived. "I'm no wee girl. Let me go and I'll walk away without a backward glance, but try to keep me here and you'll see exactly what I am." The centaur studied her for a moment, then lowered his head. "You're free to go whenever you like, although night will be falling soon, and even I will not travel the swamp by night, and I've spent the last 300 years learning every moorhen and woolly sedge for miles around." This wasn't what Gilly wanted to hear, but truth rang out loud and clear in his tone. The centaur sensed her indecision. "How about you stay a while?" He unstrapped the waterskin from around his shoulder and passed it to her. "Catch your breath. Have some dinner. My name is Dix, and you're welcome to stay for as long as you like in my hovel. Perhaps I can advise you on your travels." "I have yet to meet anything in this wretched realm that hasn't wanted to enslave or destroy me." She walked slowly backward toward the exit, the dagger held out in front of her. "You can't expect me to accept that you're the one honest centaur in a hell world full of villains." "You have every right to be skeptical," he said, pulling back the waterskin and taking a draw from its contents. Wiping his lips, he gave her an expression tinged with disappointment. "And as I said, you're free to go at any time." Dick stopped speaking and leaned in, his eyes narrowing before broadcasting a look of recognition. "That's a fine necklace you're wearing, miss. I've seen its like before." Steps away from the way out, Gilly paused. "You have?" At his nod, she blurted out her question without hesitation. "Do you know how to remove it?" "Aye, wee one, I can." Then he frowned. "But not tonight." Gilly deflated, disappointment robbing her of the burst of hope she'd felt a moment ago. That elation returned a second later when he continued. "I can do it tomorrow if you like. The supplies I need are not difficult to gather, but as I said, I won't risk the swamp at night." He could be lying, she told herself. Staying the night means staying vulnerable around him, giving him more time to put whatever betrayal he's planning into action. But do you really want to wander the swamp at night, with even less chance of seeing what's coming for you in the moonless dark? With a sigh, she returned the dagger to her boot. "I hope you're not lying to me, Dix." The centaur gave her a serious nod. "Not all of us here are out for personal gain without regard for its cost on others." He put his hands on where his hips might be, where the bottom half of him was not shaped like a horse. "What should I call ye?" "Gilly's as good a name as any," she said, watching as he moved deeper into the dwelling, lighting tar-tipped torches at intervals along the walls. The centaur's home was not much more than a dry cave. Rushes had been tossed on the floor to absorb some of the mud and filth that was tracked in from the marsh, and she could see old soiled fabrics hung on the walls here and there as a sad form of decoration. "So, Dix, how did you find yourself on Paranormalbooks?" she asked, picking her way to a chair of sorts, made of woven vines. She sat after making certain it would support her weight, and turned her attention to her host. "There was a war in my home realm, and several of my kind were scattered to the web. I made a happy life for some time in a realm of halflings. They found my size intriguing, and the fact that I could reach things they never could, not to mention cover long distances, meant I was useful. It wasn't until I decided to search for more of my kind that I fell to trickery and found myself here." "Sounds like a common issue for this place. I suppose it's hard to attract tourism to a hell realm." The centaur laughed. "You're a clever wee thing. I cannot imagine how you ended up in the swamp of pain." "Of course it's called that. This realm has cornered the market on place names chosen with extreme literalness." She shook her head and fought the urge to roll her eyes. "It's a long story short on decency, I'm afraid." Gilly picked up the waterskin he'd left on a nearby table and sniffed at its contents, then tried a small taste. Smelling and tasting nothing out of the ordinary, she took a proper drink, closing her eyes as the dryness in her throat dissipated. "I would still like to hear it," Dix prompted, moving around dishes in what must have been a kitchen of sorts. He returned with a tray of food, which he set on the table beside the waterskin, then settled himself on the floor in a sitting position. "Okay, then. Forgive me if this isn't your typical dinner conversation," Gilly said, picking up a biscuit and holding it, not attempting a bite until she saw the centaur dig into his. "A demon brought me here under false pretenses. He'd promised to transport my companion and I elsewhere, but he ditched her and brought me here, just in time to be captured by raiders." The centaur gave her a look of empathy. "I sometimes think there are more raiders in this realm than regular citizens." "Well, in his quest for profit, this particular raider marched me across the desert and into your swamp." "And who is buying women in this swamp?" Dix's expression was serious, but the phrasing of his question set Gilly laughing. She couldn't help herself. So much had happened, terrible and ridiculous things, that the absurdity of the moment hit her. She laughed until tears streamed from her eyes. "I'm sorry," the centaur said, appearing out of sorts. "I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't," she said, wiping her eyes and giving him a genuine smile. "You'll have to forgive me. I slipped into hysteria for a moment there." Gilly took a deep breath and fanned her face. "And to answer your question, it seems the Prince of Darkness is willing to pay top dollar for someone like me." "Prince of Darkness, you say?" he murmured, abandoning his dinner in favor of a long pipe. She watched him pack it with tobacco and puff it alight. The centaur turned his attention back to her, and Gilly thought she saw a new light of understanding in his eyes. "That's what I'm told," she said, her voice trailing off as a hint of doubt entered her. "It probably isn't wise to tell anyone about my value to the realm's ruler," she told herself. She kept her gaze trained on the centaur for any hint of greed or malice, but he continued to smoke his pipe peacefully. "You barely touched your dinner," he pointed out after a moment. "Can I say I blame you? I'm used to simple fare, but an off-worlder like you hasn't yet adapted to what the swamp provides." He stood and trotted back to the kitchen, returning with a small frosted cake. "A peddler was through these parts only yesterday. I purchased this cake on a whim, never knowing I might have company. I'd like you to have it." He proffered the cake, and Gilly hesitated. "It's such a delicacy here, I'm sure. Shouldn't you enjoy it yourself?" Dix gave a lazy shrug. "Its sweetness would be wasted on me. Please, as my guest." She took the cake and gave him a grateful smile. One bite had her moaning, and soon Gilly had gobbled up every bite. "That was scrumptious. I've not tasted anything as good since leaving my realm." "If you will forgive me," Dix said with a yawn, "but dawn comes early to the Swamp of Pain, and if I'm to help you remove that collar, we'll need every hour of the morning we can get. I'm afraid I don't have a space prepared for guests, but I do have a few clean furs." Gilly watched as he covered an open space on the floor with fresh furs, then gestured to an alcove just beyond the kitchen. "I'll get some rest back there. I pray that your blade remains in your boot." "Me too," she murmured as he retreated, putting out torches as he went only until one remained, its light flickering in eerie ways against the cave walls. She moved over to the pile of furs, figuring they would be softer than the vine chair. It was the most comfortable bedding she'd experienced since the inn in Acutics, but Gilly knew sleep would evade her. Although the centaur had offered his hospitality, she couldn't trust that he wouldn't try something inappropriate while she slumbered. If he's waiting to catch me off guard, then the middle of the night while I slumber would present his best opportunity, which means I must refuse to sleep. Gilly sat, legs folded, and proceeded to stretch her muscles one by one, hoping it would relieve some of the tension she felt. Trust came hard in a hell realm, and she knew she wouldn't be comfortable until she'd escaped this place. She wasn't sure how much time had passed before she heard the first moan coming from the centaur's bedroll. It was followed by worried mutterings, putting Gilly back on edge. "No, you canna," she heard Dick sob, then heard the creature thrashing in his blankets. Dread dropped into her stomach. He's having a nightmare. Chapter 18. The torch sputtered, the light dipping before flaring up again. She heard the vines that blocked the entrance to the cave rustling against one another, and her anxiety retched up. Fishing her dagger from her boot, Gilly held it at the ready, her heart pounding in her chest. A horrible shout from the back of the cave distracted her, and when she turned back toward the entrance, she saw a large shadow lurking among the vines. It took a step forward, revealing the mud-covered figure of Solomon. His voice was low and rough when he spoke. "You should not have left me!" Gilly knew she was in for a confrontation of epic proportions, but even that knowledge couldn't dissuade her from her usual sarcastic reply. "Well, if it isn't the old hammerer of the dunes himself. Looks like the scourge of the sands has become the menace of the mud." His eyes narrowed as he looked at her, his face all sharp angles. His cold countenance had her repressing a shiver. "I suppose that's your handiwork," she said, jerking a thumb over her shoulder at the centaur's alcove. Solomon didn't reply to her question, instead advancing on her, his strong arms rigid by his side, his hands screwed up into fists. "You put yourself in danger by abandoning me."
No, I got myself out of danger. You're just angry that I left you behind. I wasn't worried, you know, she told him casually, disguising the disquiet that was raging through her. I was confident you could get yourself out of that mess. And look, here you are. Your tongue will be your downfall, Fae, he growled. Mark my words. And your arrogance will be yours, she stood, rounding on him. You aren't welcome here, so you can see your way out before I wake up my host and tell him we have an uninvited guest. That one will wake when I allow it, he stared down at her, his expression black. He has to pay for dragging me off course and putting his hands on my merchandise. He says I'm free to go whenever I want, unlike you. Gilly knew her words were only delaying the inevitable, but in the moment they felt like justice. Her heart pounded harder, and she broke out into a sweat. You're no less naive now than the day you landed in this realm. You wouldn't know danger if it tugged on your ear. He reached out for her, but she slapped his hand away, flourishing the dagger once again. Try it and you'll find yourself one hand lighter. The centaur wouldn't hurt me. He's promised to help me. Gilly couldn't understand why her words had slowed. She took a step back, realizing that her heartbeat felt sluggish. Falling back onto her bottom, she looked up at him quizzically. Every word felt like climbing a mountain. What did you do? Not me, he said, his voice filled with menace. Solomon stalked to the alcove where the centaur lay whimpering. Rise, denizen of the swamp, and explain yourself. Gilly tried to rise, grabbing at the vine chair and attempting to pull her way up, but her muscles disobeyed her. Her body felt stiff, and moving started to hurt enough that she fell back onto the furs again. She heard Dick's gasp and the clatter of hooves as the centaur came to its feet. Who are ye? What are ye doing in my hovel? I'm the owner of the Fae you captured in the swamp. I'm here to reclaim my property. Gilly turned over, carefully and painfully angling herself so she could finally see the confrontation. Solomon's voice was hostile, but the centaur didn't back down from his tone. Pulling himself to his full height, which was level with Solomon's own, Dick stared him down. That we think doesn't belong to ye, he warned, then raised his hind legs, his forelocks pawing at the air threateningly. You best go before you're trampled. Solomon took a step back, covering his mouth with his scarf, when a sudden rush of sand whipped into the hovel surrounding him. Gilly closed her eyes wearily, knowing what was about to unfold. When she heard the roar of his monstrous form, her suspicions were confirmed. By the time she opened her eyes again, the sand had departed, leaving all 9 feet of angry muscle that was the dev's alternate form howling down at the now cowering centaur. Solomon grabbed him by the throat, lifting the creature off the ground until all 4 hooves were flailing in air. What did you give her? Dix choked, struggling to free himself, but Solomon kept a tight hold. You will tell me, or you'll spend the rest of your life in a nightmare from which you will not wake. Do not test me, centaur. Eyes bulging, Dix pointed to his mouth, struggling to reply but unable to with the pressure on his voice box. Solomon must have relaxed his grip, because soon the centaur was babbling in a hoarse voice. The cake was drugged, he admitted, and Gilly closed her eyes again, this time in shame. I'm a leafin' idiot. Solomon was right. I was in danger the whole time, only I was too stupid to see it. What drug? Why did you drug her? Solomon demanded, shaking him like a wolf with a rabbit between his jaws. She told me you intended to sell her to the prince, he gasped, his face redder than his beard. Told me she was worth a fortune. I know about the prince, about his collection, so I fed her a potion that would make her muscles stiffen until she couldn't move them. Gilly's mind reacted in horror to Dix's admission. Using all her strength, she attempted to straighten her limbs, then flexed them, to keep her body under her own control. But despite intense pain, she could move them only inches. Tears leaked from her eyes, but she couldn't move her hands to wipe them away. He lied to keep me here, to lure me into trusting him enough to eat the tainted cake. The centaur had no intention of freeing her from the iron collar. It was all a ruse, and she'd fallen for it without hesitation. The realization was another blow to her self-esteem. Gilly saw herself as a smart woman, a formidable enemy, and a force that was not easily controlled. Yet I keep proving myself to be a naive child with no say over the things that keep happening to me. She sank deeper into the depression that had dogged her steps since setting foot in the Hell Realm. Pushing herself to move only resulted in her rolling onto her back. Her muscles were so tight she knew she couldn't bend them. Staring up at the ceiling, Gilly prayed for relief. "Please, I can't bear this." "Where is the antidote?" This was a roar that shook the cave hard enough for pieces of the ceiling to crash to the floor. "I have none," the centaur admitted. "She'll be a living statue soon. A perfect complement to the prince's collection. Isn't that what you wanted?" "You've just signed your death warrant," Solomon replied, his tone like frost. No, please," Dix moaned. "I know where you can find the antidote. In the deepest part of the swamp there is a flower, a water lily." The centaur continued to dangle, his hands trying to pry away Solomon's grip, but his efforts were as useless as building a dam on a dry riverbed in a drought. "Where is it? How do I find it?" Gilly listened with only half an ear as the centaur gave Solomon instructions. She could feel panic climbing inside her. Not being able to move freely was a terrifying proposition. She'd lost her autonomy since her arrival in this realm, but not her hope. If she could move, she might be able to escape. But now, what hope is there if I can't even blink my eyes? "What aren't you telling me?" Solomon demanded, and she heard the centaur cough loudly as Solomon presumably tightened his grip around the creature's throat. "Serpents guard the lilies," he gasped out at last. "Their fangs are poison." There was a moment of silence. Gilly lay there, watching the light flickering against the ceiling of the cave, and waiting for what came next. There was a loud snap, and the sound of a body thudding to the ground. A few moments later, Solomon's face appeared in front of her eyes. His dark eyes were wild, and she wanted to recoil at the sight of his tusks, but she couldn't move. A hand reached for her, and with a gentle touch he brushed away her tears. Gilly was amazed at his tenderness, which was at odds with his form. He just snapped the neck of the creature who drugged me with the intention of selling me to the same buyer, and yet I can't say that I'm upset. Dick's tried to trick me, just like seemingly half the people in my life have done. Solomon, at least, has always been upfront about his intentions. He shook his head, and for a moment she thought she read sympathy in his eyes, but then he straightened, and she was no longer able to get a good look at his face. "We're going after the antidote," he growled, and she felt his hands lift her, his touch soft. Solomon tucked her into one muscular arm, holding her against his broad bronze chest. "I won't let you down, Mujisa. You can trust that." Gilly had no choice but to. She'd never been more helpless, more at the world's mercy, than in this moment. Solomon carried her from the cave into the black night outside it. She could see the stars above, covered in places by a grey haze, but little else was visible. "I will keep you safe," Solomon whispered, looking down on her again with compassion. "You should try and rest." With a finger he carefully closed her eyes, leaving Gilly in darkness. "Sleep while I fix this." "I hope you can," she said, but no words came out because she couldn't make her lips move. "Because too long like this, and I'll lose my mind completely." Chapter 19. Gilly woke at the sound of curses. She attempted to open her eyes, but could not, the potion having robbed her of all control over her own body. She was surprised she'd fallen asleep at all. It was nearly impossible to banish the panic inside her, the thought that her condition might become permanent. How long does he have to retrieve the antidote? If he fails to find it, will I be in this state for the rest of my life? That is no life I will live, she told herself. While her heart might still beat and her brain still function, Gilly refused to face the rest of her life, however many millennia that might be, trapped as a mind inside a motionless body. I will find some way to end things. Another curse brought her attention back to the present. She was in the crook of Monster Solomon's warm arm, swaying gently as he walked. The rhythm of his motion was soothing, and she found herself floating close to slumber again. Then a jolt brought her back to full consciousness, followed by a string of curses. I must set you down, Mujisa, to deal with some troublemakers. Don't fret. I'll retrieve you momentarily. Gilly felt herself being propped against something hard, her back and behind supported in what felt like a stone seat of some sort. She felt something tugging on her eyelids, and soon her eyes were open. She found herself staring into her monstrous companion's anxiety-laden eyes. "I promise to be quick." He gave her a nod, then started off, and Gilly watched him as he paced into grasses that reached his waist. She noticed that his hammer was in his hands. Solomon's head swiveled as he crept further into the grass. A loud croak caught her attention, and suddenly Solomon dropped, no longer visible in the grass. She heard a thud, then another croak, this one reminding her of the ones she'd heard around the lake. The image of the amphibious creature in her dreams came to mind again, and Gilly was forced to imagine the battle taking place in the grass. She could see the grass waving, hearing the cries, croaks, and blows, but she could find no trace of her companion or his enemies. A sudden streak of green flew from the grass to land with a lifeless thud a few feet from where she was sitting. Gilly's eyes widened, taking in the form of a large frog-like creature with bulging, sightless eyes and webbed appendages. Slick green skin covered its back, turning to yellow on its belly. Its mouth hung open, exposing a row of nasty pointed teeth. So that's what was hiding around the lake. She kept her eyes on the grass, waiting for Solomon to re-emerge. A few more blurs of color, some screams, and a lot of blue-tinted blood splattered over the grass, and then a long, gurgling moan finally gave way to silence. A few moments later, she heard the trudge of footsteps in her direction. Gilly felt her body lifted and found herself once again cradled in one of Monster Solomon's arms. The lingering odor of sweat, mud, and amphibian blood clung to him, and she could see a cut on his other arm that was slowly weeping. "The terrain grows thicker," he said. She could feel his words echoing inside his chest since her face rested there, close to his heart. Its steady beat was comforting, one of the only things keeping her from full-blown terror. "We must be getting close to the swamp's center." He spoke to her then, while he walked through the mud-soaked and aggressive landscape. The hum of the words in his chest soothed her. "When I was a boy, my mother would take me to the edges of the swamp that lay within my father's lands. There was a swamp cat there, one she'd fed since it was small, that had grown to trust her. Mother would hold me, much like I'm holding you now, and carry me toward the tall grasses. She'd set a small earthen bowl of raw meat just outside the grass and make a sound with her lips to call it." Gilly tried to imagine Solomon as a young boy, which was difficult considering he was now a 9-foot-tall giant with tusks, but the image of a bronze-skinned child with dark hair and inquisitive eyes appeared at last. He held one of his mother's fingers in his chubby hand as she carried him closer to the grasses. Gilly would have smiled at the thought if her muscles had worked. Little Solomon, cute as a button, his round cheeks emphasized when he smiled. "One day the cat didn't come," he continued. "Mother was heartbroken, thinking the cat had met its demise. We were walking there a few weeks later, collecting reeds to make baskets, when the grasses started to shake." She could feel his chest humming, a pleasant sensation, and she wanted to nestle closer. "Mother picked me up, worried it was a predator, but instead, 2 kittens tumbled out of the bulrushes. The swamp cat followed close behind, keeping an eye on its litter. Mother was delighted, and soon we were coming to the marsh daily once again, bonding with the kittens and providing the mother with additional nutrients with which to feed her children." He paused, and for a moment Gilly thought he might not resume speaking. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Solomon said at last. "I suppose it's to show you that sometimes good things can come from unexpected places." Gilly pondered his meaning as well as his intention. Why would he find that important to share now? It was a sweet story, but she couldn't see a parallel to their current situation. Is he speaking about himself? Does Solomon consider himself a good man in a bad situation? If so, Gilly wasn't certain she could agree with him. "And what about yourself?" an inner voice asked. "Are you a good thing?" She'd always thought so, until her sister Lena had made her understand her own blind spot in the war between Fae factions. A certain amount of viciousness was accepted in her life, she realized now. Am I so different from him? Yes, she told herself without hesitation. He may seem to be helping me now, but it isn't me he's really helping. It's himself. He's only doing this to make sure his merchandise is in tip-top shape for the prince. Gilly clung to that fact like a climber to a cliff face after the rope snaps. No matter how I feel about him, the truth is, he's my enemy, and I need to get away from him at the first opportunity. I'm sorry, Mujisa, he said hoarsely, and for a second Gilly thought she felt a difference in the vibration of his words. I never meant for this to happen. It should have been a different journey for us. But here we are, and... His words cut off, and Gilly sat suspended, waiting for them to start again. Her position was such that she could see the bottom of his chin, the protruding tusks, a hint of jet-black hair, and the underside of 2 ivory horns curving out past his head. Beyond that was just hazy sky. She stared at it now, waiting for Solomon to speak. I see them. See what? What do you see? The frustration of not being able to talk was almost as terrible as not being able to move. There is a pond 1/4 of a mile from here, surrounded by willowy trees and dense green grasses. In the pond I can see lily pads and, yes, 1 pristine white lily. The kernel of hope that refused to die flared to brilliant life inside her once again. If we can reach the lily, then I can be rid of this horrible affliction. But remember the snakes. She wanted to shout the warning when Solomon set off walking again in what she assumed was the direction of the pond. Anxiety ballooned inside her, growing stronger with every step forward. Although the entire journey to this point had been fraught with danger, there was something horrible about knowing there was something in particular lying in wait. And it's made even worse by the fact that I can't lend a hand in defeating the guardians. I can't even defend myself. I'm a literal dead weight around Solomon's neck. She heard the sound of his footsteps splashing gently in puddles as they got closer to the pond. I've got to find a place to stash you, he said softly. Somewhere you can be safe while I swim out to retrieve the flower. Gilly was about to tell him that there were no safe places in a hell realm, remembering when he'd told her much the same, but no words came out of her mouth. She wanted to squeeze his hand to warn him to be careful, but all she could do was lie in his arms and worry. Here we are, he said, shifting her so that her back was against the trunk of a tree. It's not ideal, but you should be able to keep an eye on things from here. Solomon crouched in front of her, his monstrous form no longer seeming so monstrous. There was a kindness in his eyes, a tenderness in his touch that made Gilly feel at ease with him. Wish me luck. He smiled, knowing that she couldn't speak, and Gilly was both annoyed and amused. For the first time, she had nothing snarky to say, even if given the chance. Good luck. Come back to me unharmed and with that damned lily. She sat stiffly in the grass, propped up by the tree, and watched as Solomon charged toward the pond. He did not hesitate, walking in until the water was deep enough to swim. Even in his gigantic form, he was a graceful swimmer. Gilly could see the lily pads before him, and a hint of white that must be the flower Dix had told him about. She hoped against hope the centaur had told the truth about this one thing. Suddenly, Solomon's head ducked under water. He broke the surface, then was tugged under again. Fear filled her to the brim, but she was powerless to do anything but watch. A glimmer of silver caught her eye, and if she weren't already paralyzed, fright might have done it to her in that moment. A long silver serpent cut across the water toward the place where Solomon was submerged. It went under, but not before Gilly saw 2 more converging on its location. Dix had warned them about the guardians of the lilies, but part of her had thought it might be a last bit of misdirection from the centaur. Instead, it was all too true. Solomon! She screamed in her mind, wondering why it was taking him so long to surface. When he finally did, it was at the extreme edge of her vision. She could see something that looked like a silver rope wrapped around his torso and one of his arms. He bobbed in the water, attempting to free himself from the first serpent when 2 more found him. The dev went under again, leaving behind only bubbles. Gilly was sick with worry over him, wondering if he would surface again. Then she felt something brush past her boot and refocused her vision. That was when true terror flooded her. A silver serpent, its body as wide as her thigh, opened its mouth and hissed at her. Chapter 20. She watched the snake advance, tucking its head under her arm to slither across her torso. Oh, please, bloody no, not now, not ever. Gilly was not the type to be afraid of a snake. She'd dealt with countless of them in the Fae Wilds, finding the best method of dealing with them was to ignore them. But she couldn't ignore the snake that was trying to wrap itself around her now. Their bite is poisonous. Now that Tix's warning about the serpents was borne out, she was inclined to believe the centaur about the venomous fangs. She'd never felt more vulnerable than she did in that moment waiting for the snake to strike. She couldn't even close her eyes against the inevitable. She was forced to watch as the snake reared up and opened its mouth wide, exposing dripping, deadly fangs. This is it, she thought to herself, wondering how long it would take before the poison was pumped through her veins and into her heart. How long she'd have to sit here stone still, waiting for the venom to kill her. Would it be a painful death or a peaceful one? Whatever kind of death it would be, Gilly was not eager to face it. But face it she would, with every scrap of bravery she had remaining. There was a sudden blur of motion, and then, with the thwack of a hammer against a serpent's skull, a silver streak flew out of her field of vision, banishing the snake a second before it could strike. Her heart was beating against her ribcage so hard it was almost painful, but relief flooded her. I'm not going to die, at least not in this moment. Solomon was crouching in front of her again, his clothing dripping with pond water. It took some work, but I managed it, he said, then held out the flower. It rested in his large cupped hands, a perfect white lotus, its bottommost petals tinged with pink, and a white center that emitted a soft floral scent. Gilly watched his fingers pluck a petal and hold it out to her. I know you can't choose, so I'm going to help you, okay? We'll get this into you one way or another. Solomon pressed the petal between her lips, then closed her mouth around it. Moving her jaw gently, he attempted to grind the petal up as best as he could. Pulling out the water skin, he poured a small stream into her mouth, then moved his finger up and down her throat, trying to help her to swallow. It was a painstaking process, but he repeated it over and over, working pieces of petals into her mouth and helping her to swallow them down. At last she could feel her tongue start to move, her mouth start to take over. She chewed, then swallowed, and opened her mouth to let out a sigh of relief. I can move, she croaked, then felt her fingers start to twitch. It's working! Solomon let out a hoot of joy, then handed her over another petal. This one she was able to chew and swallow on her own. She could feel the tension in her muscles start to unlock, the stiffness start to fade. After another petal, she felt well enough to have Solomon help her to her feet. Thank you, she said at last, when she could move her arms to encircle his neck. Pulling herself in for a tight hug, she melted into him when his strong arms wrapped around her. I was afraid I would never be released. It was a fate worse than death I was facing. He nodded, but Gilly thought she saw a shadow pass over his face. Those serpents got more than they bargained for. I have half a mind to skin them and make a pair of boots. Gilly laughed. It was a rough sound, but it felt good. She gently loosened her grip and stepped out of his arms before the moment became awkward. Now that I can move again, I think we should get out of here. This damn swamp is worse than Ixaria on King's Day. I have no idea what your reference means, but I agree with the sentiment. He looked up at the suns above them, gauging their position. There isn't much light left, and we are severely off course, but we could make up some miles before we find a place to sleep tonight. Gilly nodded, then motioned for him to lead the way. She followed, wondering how much longer they'd be surrounded by the perils of the Swamp of Pain, watching the broad back of her companion as she kept a lookout for potential trouble. Gilly knew deep inside that he'd keep her safe from whatever came looking for a meal. But what about when we reach the Prince's Keep? Will he protect me then, or will he betray me worse than the others did? Twilight was tinging the world around her purple, but she wasn't struck by her usual bout of exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that she'd been carried around like a babe by Solomon, or because she'd been unable to move, but Gilly felt more energized than she had in a long time. Just being able to turn her head to look in another direction was a delight after being deprived of it. Small things that she took for granted, like a self-determined point of view, took on a new importance now. What about up there? She asked, pointing at a sturdy-looking branch in a sparsely needled pine tree they were passing. Solomon looked where she pointed and furrowed his brow. I hadn't considered sleeping in a tree. Nothing beats a cave when going to ground. If you haven't thought of it, maybe the creatures that lurk in this infernal place won't think to look for us up there either, Gilly said, approaching the tree and starting to climb it. She pulled herself up the thick bark easily, walking out onto the limb and waving to Solomon. Careful now, he said, his face looking strained. Why don't you sit down? Gilly laughed. You know that I've spent my entire life in trees, don't you? Unlike you, Dev, who seemed obsessed with sand for some reason, we Fae know how to lead elegant lives in the treetops. It was Solomon's turn to chuckle. Among all that elegance, you never once got a splinter. She pursed her lips, then stuck her tongue out at him, making him laugh harder. I think you're just delaying. Don't you know how to climb a tree? Solomon shook his head, shooting her a distrustful look. You're trying to get me to head up there, then when the branch snaps under my weight, you'll cross your fingers that I'll break my neck. Well, now that you say it. The trees in the wilds were strong and sturdy, but she couldn't say the same about these. They were unfamiliar and seemed more brittle than the hardy ones she was used to. Solomon scowled at her, then walked out of sight. Gilly tiptoed out onto the thinnest part of the branch, craning her neck to find him. She caught a hint of his jet-black hair, then it disappeared again in the underbrush. For a second she thought he might have deserted her again, but without warning he appeared, landing gracefully on the branch beside her. Gilly's eyes widened. That was a neat trick. Looks like you decided to change for bed. Covering her mouth, she fought back a giggle. He was back in his regular form, his weight easily supported by the limb. She watched him walk carefully back to the trunk and slid down to a seated position, his back against the dark brown trunk. Solomon pulled the pack from his bag, then passed her the water skin. Gilly drank greedily, handing it back in exchange for the piece of dragon fruit he'd handed her. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the sunlight fade. You should rest, he told her after a moment. Not so fast, she said, holding up a finger. You've barely slept since I met you. You've been walking through nights, staying up to keep watch, and generally running on almost no rest. It's my turn to take the first watch. He started to shake his head, but she fixed him with a stern expression. You carried me the whole day yesterday. The potion basically forced me to rest every single muscle. You can trust me to defend us for one night. But can I trust you not to flee me? He said, his tone gruff. Gilly started. I hadn't even thought about tricking him and running off into the night. That spooked her. She covered it up quickly with a roll of her eyes. Do you think I want to go up against whatever lurks in the night? I could barely survive the swamp at high noon. Anything could be waiting to pounce out there. His eyes were on her, searching her face for any hints of truth. I will rest, he said at last, tucking the pack behind him once more. But only if you remain in my arms throughout the night. What? She asked unsteadily, a suspicious look on her face. He scowled. That wasn't what I meant. He reached out for her, guiding her to sit in the crook of his legs, her back against his chest. She felt his arms encircle her waist. If you sit right here, keeping your watch, I will rest. Gilly frowned. The heat of his arms warmed her in the cooling night. But the thought of choosing to place herself there didn't sit right. I don't think... That's my offer. Take it or expect me to stand watch for another night. Fine, Gilly grumbled, figuring she needed him at full strength for the rest of their journey together. Who knows what monstrosity we will face tomorrow? But your hands stay where they are now, or I shove your sleeping carcass out of this tree. Agreed, he said with a small smile. Wake me after 4 hours. When she tried to protest, telling him it wasn't enough time, he tightened his grip on her. 4 hours is plenty, trust me, and you'll need some sleep of your own. Agreed, she said, figuring a compromise was better than losing outright. She sat there, her eyes trained on the darkness, her sensitive ears picking up every insect buzz and flap of wings. She could feel the tension seeping out of the man who held her in a tight embrace, and relief filled her to know he was finally sleeping. The night stretched out before her, a blank screen on which to replay her interactions with the slumbering Dev. He saved me again today, she realized. He'd been defending her against everything the Hell Realm had thrown at her, in fact, and as a result, it was hard not to feel some affection for him. She tried to remind herself that it was all to his own benefit, but weighing the risks, she realized he was putting in a lot of effort, not to mention risking the very real chance of death, all to drag her across hell and hand her off to another man. Gilly was beginning to wonder if Solomon had it in him. The amount of compassion that radiated off him, the fierceness with which he'd claimed her as his own, was at odds with his stated intention. You can't read minds without the help of magic, the crone had taught her that, meaning that knowing what another person was thinking, what their motivation was for their actions, was basically unknowable in the natural realm. Only something supernatural could pierce that veil, and then not for long. I wish I could read his mind now, Gilly sighed, and instinctively Solomon tightened his grip. She tried to suppress a smile, knowing the feelings she refused to recognize were dangerous ones. Lena, where are you? If her sister and her rescue squad showed up, Gilly wouldn't have to navigate such treacherous emotions. She thought back to the times she'd seen through her sister's eyes back in the Fae Realm, desperate for answers, for a timeline for her rescue, and for a person who understood her almost as well as she understood herself. Gilly closed her eyes and tried to summon her sister across the vast distance between them. An image flashed into her mind. It was a blur, a jumble of colors and loud sounds. Wherever Lena was, it was chaos. Head aching, Gilly opened her eyes, giving up on the vision. As if he could sense her disappointment, Solomon shifted, his hand rising to cross her chest and grip her shoulder. It was a more intimate hold, and for a moment she considered waking him, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned her head back against him and inhaled his rugged scent. Whatever fantasy I want to spin between us is just that, a fantasy. I need to remember that. Giving her affection to a man who sought to enslave her was not a wise thing to do, and whatever she felt for him was doomed to end the moment they entered the prince's palace. Although her brain understood it, her heart refused to hear it. It beat in time with his own as they held each other through the night.
Chapter 21. Gilly blinked into the sunlight hitting her face from between the leaves on the branches above her. She turned her head, realizing she was no longer encircled by Solomon's strong arms. In fact, the Dev was nowhere to be seen. She stood, stretching lightly, then scrambled down the tree as quickly as the iron collar would allow. At the bottom, Gilly scouted around for her lost captor. When she didn't see him right away, an idea formed. Go, now, while he isn't around. You've got to be close to the borders of the swamp now. This may be your last chance. Gilly started forward, then paused when she heard Solomon's voice. Going somewhere, Mujisa? He walked out from behind a nearby tree, his face hard, as if he'd read her mind. To relieve myself, she said tartly, then walked into the grasses, headed for a bush not far away. She burned with embarrassment, knowing that he'd caught her and was likely laughing behind her back this very moment. She returned to his side shortly after, and he held out a brown mushroom. Breakfast. Are you sure we should eat anything you find in this place? Even the cakes I'd poison. He gave her a half smile, then popped the mushroom into his own mouth. These grow in many places around the realm. They're harmless, and quite tasty if you enjoy mushrooms. When he offered her another one, she took it and placed it in her mouth. It had an earthy flavor with a nutty undertone. Not bad, she said after a moment. Too bad you don't have time to boil them up with some herbs and a little butter. Too bad indeed, he said, passing her another. We don't even have the luxury of a table. We've got to make up ground today. We've nearly cleared the swamp, but we've got some climbing to do after this, so I hope you're ready for a workout. Give me a few more of these mushrooms and I won't let you down, she said. He chuckled and passed them over, then started off through the grass. Gilly followed, chewing the mushroom and keeping her eyes peeled for any signs of danger. By mid-morning, they'd made it through the outer reaches of the marsh, rocky soil replacing the dense, damp mud. Solomon pointed into the distance where rocky cliffs rose above them. The Prince's Keep is over that ridge. If we push ourselves, we could make it before we lose the light.
Gilly eyed the craggy black peaks, frowning. That looks like quite a climb. In actuality, it would have been an easy half-day's jog if she'd been free of the iron, but even with it, she knew they could meet his timeline. But standing here, feeling the wind whipping around her face and knowing it might be the last free air she had a chance to breathe, Gilly was filled with the sudden desire to delay. Solomon's eyes cut to her, a stiff expression on his face. What's wrong, Fae? Too much for you? And I thought your race was famed for its athleticism and balance. You also thought we all had wings, so maybe you're not the expert you think you are. The words came out sharper than intended, but her nerves were wrestling with her temper at the thought of being turned over to the prince for his collection. Her captor started, caught off guard by her shifting emotions. His expression tightened. No more dawdling. No more escape attempts, he said plainly. The ruckus we've caused on our way here, it wouldn't surprise me to find that the prince was well aware of our approach and is observing us even now. Any more drama and he might think something is off about the sale. Gilly crossed her arms over her chest, feeling all the warmth of the night before seeping out of her. What is the reason you're selling me, Dev? And don't tell me money, because you'd be a fool to face the risks you have just for coin. We're talking about a lot of coin, Mujisa. More than most will see in their lifetimes, even those of us who live for a long, long time. Even so, she countered, you've risked life and limb many times over. Life is a risk, he shot back. Any breath could be our last. Stop with the philosophical distractions and answer me, Gilly tried to keep from sounding frantic, but she knew there was a little time left to plead her case. Why you're selling me to the prince? Because having one of the princes of darkness owe you a favor is worth more than any amount of coin. His words had the unmistakable ring of truth to them. Gilly fought against frustrations, not willing to give up now that they'd reached this point of openness between them. What will you use that favor for? What could be worth what you're about to do to me? Solomon's face hardened, and she could feel the wall go up between them. I have been waiting for an opportunity like this my entire life, Fae, and none of your sweet talk is going to dissuade me from my intention. That's not an answer, Gilly jabbed her finger into his chest, her anger overflowing. You are about to chain me to a life of servitude in a realm far away from my own, and I've done nothing to you. I deserve an answer. You think an answer will make you feel better? Solomon scoffed. I have a hint for you. It won't. It must be something, whatever it is, Gilly countered. Based on your unwillingness to admit it, I would assume it's something shameful, something you don't want others to know. Ashamed? His face darkened. What would you know about shame? You're a creature of light, right? Gilly frowned and opened her mouth to argue, but he held his large hand over her mouth. Staring down into her eyes, he spoke with a fierceness that startled her. I'm going to use that favor to get back what belongs to me. I will reclaim my ancestral name, my birthright. His eyes searched her face. Then he released her. Let's go. You're wasting time. He set off, looking back to make sure she was following. Gilly sped up her steps, unwilling to let the matter drop. What birthright? What do you mean by ancestral name? Nothing, he snapped at her, making her flinch. It doesn't matter. Tomorrow you will belong to the prince, and you won't be my problem any more. He picked up speed, leaving her to scurry behind him, his back stiff, his demeanor cold. Gilly could feel her spirit sinking. It seemed no matter how close she'd felt to him, he'd never felt the same. She was a means to an end for him, and no matter what she faced as a possession of the prince, it would not turn him away from pursuing his birthright. They stood at the top of the ridge, staring at the rocky valley below. It's there, Solomon said, pointing to what appeared to be a natural formation of glassy obsidian. A volcano erupted here eons ago, collapsing into itself. It is said a river of lava still flows underground. That eruption caused these formations, and the prince took advantage of it, building his keep within the rock. At first, Gilly could see no keep, just the jagged rock spire pointing like a finger into the sky. But when she shaded her eyes and looked carefully, She could see portions that couldn't have been created by nature. Still, the keep blended in well. "We'll head down the ridge to the flat valley below," he said. "It may look desolate from here, but you can bet the prince doesn't leave his keep undefended. We need to be on guard when we reach the valley floor." Gilly nodded, then followed him down the rocky ridge. She'd built a wall in her mind, cutting off thoughts that reminded her that she was about to become a prisoner in this realm, perhaps forever. "Lena, where are you?" she asked the air again, unable to completely cut off her anxiety about how close their journey was coming to an end. If her sister didn't arrive soon, they might have no chance of defeating the prince. We may be too late even now. Gilly had to push the thoughts away again, focusing on carefully placing her feet so as not to lose her footing. Solomon looked back over his shoulder, checking her progress. Even this close to betraying her, he still was the most handsome thing she'd ever seen. Gilly felt sick to her stomach, wondering how she could be almost as afraid of losing Solomon as she was of spending the rest of her life in a cage. Could things get any worse? As if on cue, she heard the sounds of rocks tumbling down the rock face. "We need to be down now!" Solomon turned back to grab her and enfold her in his arms. "Hold on tight!" Then he leapt off the ridge, down 30 feet to land on the flat rocks below. Gilly held him, knowing she'd not survive a fall of that height while locked in the collar. Once he was certain she was unharmed, he released her and turned back to the ridge. Gilly's gaze followed his, over the rocks where pebbles were falling loose and tumbling down. Then she saw it, and had to rub her eyes and look again. Creatures were pulling themselves out of the rock face, creatures in the vague shape of a man, although smaller, maybe 3 feet tall. They were the same color as the rock itself, blending in perfectly until they'd started to move. With lightning speed, they scrambled down the rocks and launched themselves at Solomon. The ones that missed him shattered against the rocks below. Gilly got close enough to the pieces of one to poke it, then pick it up. "It's clay. They're made of clay." Gilly grabbed her dagger and held it at the ready, but the creatures were concentrating only on Solomon. Soon he was surrounded by the clay creatures, their writhing bodies covering him so that she couldn't see his face or his arms any longer. She stood there debating whether to help him. If I do, I'm only speeding up my own betrayal. But if I don't... She wasn't sure she could stand there and watch him pulled apart by little brown men. It turned out that Solomon needed no help. He let out a roar and transitioned, blowing the majority of the little clay men off his body in the process. His monstrous form set about smashing the rest, and soon he was free of the creatures. He turned to her, fixing her with an angry glare. Before he could speak, a spurt of flame burst from the 10-foot rock in front of them. Solomon shoved Gilly behind him and prepared to face the adversary that was striking through the flames toward them. Chapter 22. Out of the fire came a figure that was nearly as tall as Solomon in his current form. Like Solomon, Holmes curved from his head, though his were black while Solomon's were the color of bone. His skin was tinged red, his eyes full black, with no white in the irises at all. A demon, Gilly thought. It must be. "The second sun in all his glory," the creature said, swaggering forward, its black robe having been slit open to allow his pointed tail to wave behind him. "So you're the one who's been raising a ruckus on the prince's territory. What in the hells are you doing here?" "I've got merchandise for the prince. It's pristine." The demon tried to glance over his shoulder, but Solomon kept Gilly out of sight behind him. The adversary's lips compressed into a flat line. "Let me inspect this merchandise so I can speak to its condition myself." "The prince may inspect it, and only the prince, and he won't appreciate being kept waiting by you when he sees what I've brought him." Gilly held her tongue, but it was tough work. She hated being talked about like a possession, although she realized that was exactly what she was. Maybe I can get away while they're distracted with each other. Her eyes scanned the valley, but all she could see was the ridge behind her and the sheer rock faces that made up the 3 other sides. "You always did think highly of yourself," the demon snorted. "That whole second son thing, for instance. Everyone knows you're a bastard His sentence was cut off by the crash of Solomon's fist into his jaw. His eyes flashed red. If that's the way you'd like to handle this, I'm game. Stay back, Solomon ordered, then lunged forward just as the demon leapt to meet him. Gilly stumbled backward, her eyes on the fight. They were evenly matched, it seemed, with each giving as good as they were getting. She turned her back on the fight and moved closer to the ridge they'd just climbed. Gilly didn't relish the thought of returning to the swamp, but any place had to be better than the Prince's Keep, where she could be guaranteed a lifetime of imprisonment. If I can make it back over the ridge before they finish bashing each other, I've got a chance. Gilly reached for the first handhold and froze. She spotted several of the clay creatures crouching among the rocks, their eyes on her. With a sigh, she turned back, realizing that her chance was no chance at all. Enough! She heard Solomon growl. He grabbed the demon by the torso and lifted him, bringing his opponent's back down on his knee and causing him to howl in pain. Solomon dropped him in the dirt and put his boot on his neck. Take me to the prince, or find yourself without a head. Your choice. Fine, the demon said, grunting. Solomon took his foot off of him, and the demon rose to his feet. You know the rules, he said, wiping a stray drop of blood from his lip. Return to your proper form, Dev, and turn over your weapon. Solomon lifted his hands, and the dust from the rocks around them encircled him, hiding him from sight. When the dust fell away, he was back in his regular form. He passed his hammer to the demon, who nodded in approval, then gestured toward the keep. I believe you know the way. Solomon turned, motioning to Gilly to attend him. She hung her head and did as he wanted, following in his footsteps as they made their way closer to the spire of obsidian before them. The prince's keep was like nothing she'd ever seen before. They'd come in through tall, angled doors into a long hallway lined with works of art, some beautiful, some fanciful, and some as dark as the realm around them. Sumptuous carpets led to a pair of oversized double doors of sparkling black. They opened, and Solomon followed the demon through them. Gilly raised a hand to touch the surface of the door, gasping to find that it was covered entirely in large black diamonds. Her eyes rose to take in the dome overhead outlined in blood-red glass. The stain on the glass gave the massive chamber a reddish tint. The wide black stone floors were without an ounce of dust or dirt. The walls featured carved wooden reliefs of naked figures in various complicated poses, identical expressions on each figure's face. Gilly couldn't figure out if their faces were contorted with pleasure or pain. The demon stopped before a polished stone dais, behind which stood a gigantic carved stone statue of a lion, jaws opening in mid-roar. Gilly catalogued every detail in the hopes of preparing for a rescue that was becoming more and more unlikely. The room was pitched into sudden darkness, and Gilly gasped, unconsciously moving closer to Solomon. He'd represented safety for her, but that was about to change. When the light returned, a figure stood on the dais in front of them. His eyes were golden and filled with a heat that had her on the verge of trembling in fear. He stood taller even than Solomon. Light brown curls with golden highlights framed a masculine face that rivaled the Fae for its beauty. His eyes lit on the Dev, ignoring Gilly entirely. "What are you doing here, second son?" he called, his voice almost guttural in its roughness. She could sense the malice in his tone. Gilly broke out in gooseflesh, making herself smaller in the hopes of avoiding his notice. She thought the panic of being frozen and unable to move was enough to break her mind, but now she wondered whether the Prince of Darkness might be able to do it with a few words. Magic radiated from him, powerful magic, at a level she knew she couldn't match, even if she'd not been wearing iron. She forced herself to turn her gaze away from him, able to breathe again, only when she wasn't looking at the formidable being before her. Solomon bent his head, showing deference to the creature he no doubt knew could obliterate him. "I have come to offer you a bargain. I've come across a rare specimen for your collection." He turned with a flourish of his arms to present Gilly. She kept her gaze on the floor, but she could still feel the prince's eyes upon her. "What do we have here?" he asked, his tone almost lacking curiosity. "If you're peddling another elf, I've got plenty already." "Not an elf, my lord," A fae? You don't say. She heard footsteps heading in her direction, then felt a finger under her chin, lifting her face. His golden eyes bored into hers. A wingless fae? That is a rarity indeed. She stood still, heart beating like she was running long distance, while the prince walked around her, inspecting her. His gaze seared her the way cold can burn the skin. She is a specimen of particular perfection, he breathed, making her shake with revulsion. Athletic but lithe, with a face of ideal proportions. Does she have any imperfections? He asked Solomon, adding with a scowl that he would be wise to report them now rather than after the sale. Nothing save one, Solomon replied, and Gilly's temper hit the roof. How dare they talk about me like an object, as if I don't have a brain in my pretty head? She has a voice, and she can answer for herself, she spat, unable to hold it in any longer. Her razor-sharp tongue, my lord, Solomon finished, gesturing toward her to state the obvious. Ahriman chuckled, shaking his head and making his soft curls bob. Indeed, though, I don't think that will be a problem for me. How did you happen to come across her? He didn't come across me. He kidnapped me. Or, more accurately, he stole me from someone else who had abducted me, who stole me from my first captor. I came here against my will, but don't worry, because I won't be staying for long. She turned to speak directly to the prince. And if you are wise, you'll release me now, because if my people have to come for me, you'll regret it. His lips curled up in a smile, his golden eyes flashing, and for a moment she got the impression of feline mischief in his expression. I admire spirit in all beings, he told her with a nod, but I prefer my specimen under glass. Without warning, he linked his arm with hers. Let's take a stroll and have a look at my collection. Gilly wanted to pull her arm away to slap the prince across his arrogant face, but she wanted to see his collection more. If this is to be my home, even for one night, I want to see what I'm facing. They followed the twists and turns of the opulent corridors to a set of iron doors with an iron lock that took 2 demon guards to disarm. The doors opened of their own accord, and the prince led her in, gesturing with pride to the large glass containers that were scattered around the enormous chamber. He strolled toward the closest one as if going for a walk in a country garden. This was my first acquisition, Ahriman said, gesturing toward the pedestal where a dryad stood, caught mid-shift. Her arms had sprouted small branches and buds, her legs growing together into roots where her feet should be. Gilly felt bad for the tree creature despite her lush, forested surroundings. The enclosure replicated a spring wood, filled with life, except nothing was moving. Her rabbit sat at the base of the tree, its dark eyes blank. The crow in the treetop's eyes shone with the same glassiness, making Gilly feel sick to her stomach. But it was the dryad's eyes that had her near weeping. They were wide and glassy, but there was something in them, some emotion living in their frozen depths. She is aware of what has happened to her. The thought made gorge rise in her throat. Gilly told herself that she was being ridiculous, but the thought stuck with her. Ahriman led her onto the next enclosure, commenting on his next collectible, a pair of kobolds in mid-fight. Gilly couldn't concentrate on his words, her mind full of a question she couldn't get up the courage to ask. Do you slaughter them, your collectibles, then have them stuffed? Is that why I see fear in their eyes? Or maybe it's the potion the centaur fed me that traps them in their bodies forever. A fate worse than death, especially for a being that is nearly immortal. She turned away, catching Solomon's eyes where he stood a few paces behind them. It was a speaking glance she sent him, asking him how he could doom her to a life like the one before them. Solomon turned his face away, refusing to meet her gaze. Chapter 23. The dryad's eyes had rattled her, but she forced herself to follow the prince on a guided tour of his entire collection. So many of the creatures she'd read about in the crone's tome were on display, frozen in eternity for the amusement of one prince. I can't let that happen to me. Ahriman released her arm at last, having reached the entrance after conducting the tour. He turned his attention to Solomon. With an appraising glance, he gave the dev an approving nod. "What say we negotiate over drinks?" How civilized, Gilly thought, holding her tongue but just barely. After drinks, why don't we start our campaign to tear children away from their parents for the laughs? They found themselves in a warm study in front of a roaring fire. Gilly perched on a cushioned bench against the wood-panelled walls, while Ahriman and Solomon sat in armchairs, sipping on glasses of deep amber liquid. It was a sophisticated environment, not one she would have expected to find in the keep of the ruler of a hell realm. The room put her on edge. In fact, the whole palace did. Outside the keep was a world waiting to murder you without regard, but inside the walls of the prince's keep one could find a veneer of high society. But underneath that veneer lies a hall of horrors, she said, still shaking from the tour. Gilly tried to focus on the men's conversation, but fear of what she was about to face kept her thoughts racing. "Your price will be dear for one such as her," Ahriman said quietly, his voice still holding a hint of roughness. "It would have to be. She's one of a kind." "Two of a kind," she almost corrected him, then thought better of it. Letting him know I have a twin could put Lena in danger. My mouth would have led to her demise, and I could not have that on my conscience. "It is dear," Solomon agreed. "Very. What I want for my prize is a fortune and a favor." The prince eyed him slowly, swirling the liquid in his glass. "A fortune goes without saying, but a favor? That is the more valuable request." Solomon nodded in agreement. "It is. I will not hide my intentions. I plan to reclaim my ancestral name and the property that goes along with it, and I want you to help me." Ahriman leaned back in his armchair and gave Solomon a searching look. "That is no small ask. And she is no small prize. I can guarantee that you'll never find her like. No one has seen anything like her, including other Fae. The winged kind didn't even recognize one of their own." "Intriguing." The prince let out a low humming sound while he thought things over. It reminded Gilly of a cat's purr, and without meaning to, she found it charming. A door to her left opened, and two female attendants stepped in. They were dressed identically in livery of blood-red featuring the head of a lion in the center of their chests. They approached her, and when they were closer, Gilly could see that they both had small black horns sprouting from their heads. They were delicate-looking and mostly hidden by their hair. "Come," said the older one. "You are due for a cleansing." Gilly shook her head, but the demons came for her. With one on either side, they easily collected her and walked her out of the room. She looked back over her shoulder, suddenly terrified that this would be the last glimpse she got of Solomon. The doors closed behind her, and Gilly went limp in the demon's arms. They dragged her into a stone chamber filled with warm steam. The edges of the room shone orange, heat radiating from them. She began to sweat almost instantly and was somewhat relieved when the women stripped the desert clothes from her body. "Cleanse yourself," the younger one instructed, pointing out a cascade of water that fell over a nearby wall. Gilly stepped closer, passing the glowing orange opening in the nearest corner. Peering into the opening, Gilly saw what appeared to be an orange river of heat burbling within the stone square bowl. "Love her venting heat into the bathing chamber," she breathed, remembering what Solomon had told her. She moved to the waterfall and held her hand under the spill of water. It reminded her of bathing under a waterfall, something she enjoyed doing at home. A creature comfort such as this amid such danger was jarring. She walked under it, finding a recessed area that held a bar of sweet-smelling soap. Gilly bathed herself, telling herself that this might be her only and last chance to do so. The warm water should have washed away her tension, but it was higher than ever. They're going to clean me, then lock me away. How will my sister find me here? There will be no dreams to reach into, no eyes to see out of, trapped forever in hell with the Prince of Darkness. "Let's go." The older demon reached in, her claw-tipped fingers gripping Gilly by the back of her neck, out from under the water. "Dry yourself," she said, thrusting a towel into her hands. Gilly toweled herself dry, taking a moment to rebraid her hair. While she did, she watched the woman debate the appropriate outfit to put her in. "White," the older one said. "She's one of the light races. They always look best in white." "She's not an angel," the younger one corrected. "She comes from a forest. She should be in green, to blend into her surroundings." "If she blends in, then no one will see her," the older one grumbled. "What about a selection of golds? It would go with her hair." Those eyes are something else, the younger one said, coming close to peer into Gilly's eyes. Little pink jewels. How about golden pink? How about something simple with room to move? Gilly added, surprising both demons. They paused, looking at her before dissolving into laughter. You don't need room to move, foolish Fae, the older one cackled. You must not have paid attention on the tour, the other one added. Now put this on. She tossed Gilly a thin linen sleeveless dress in blush pink. It dropped to her feet, a gauzy layer over her otherwise nude body. Beautiful, the younger one said. I don't think so, ladies, Gilly said, noticing how sheer the dress became in the torchlight. How about a two-piece? When the older demon shook her head, Gilly grabbed the neckline of the thin dress and pulled, ripping the dress in half. You ignorant! The old demon lunged for her, claws out, but Gilly held up a hand to stop her. Your prince wouldn't appreciate his most expensive acquisition covered in scratches, would he? The demons looked at each other, then her, twin scowls on their faces. They'd realized that their actions were as bound as her own. Gilly knew she had more leverage than she thought, but didn't of her intellect alone. Your prince has many perfectly dressed collectibles in his exhibits, but what he's missing is realism. I propose you let me wear my own clothing, as that is how he found me. She could see the rack of clothing behind them, all of them extremely formal and overly decorative. I would never have worn any of that stuff in my real life. Why make me out to be something I'm not? Doesn't authenticity count for anything? The two demons put their heads together, their expressions skeptical, but as Gilly talked them around, they seemed to accept what she was saying, especially when she made them think that it was their idea. Finally, she was standing in the outfit she'd been given at Solomon's hideout, one she knew was functional given the terrain she was about to face. Perfect, the younger demon said, clapping her hands together. Now we just need to find an appropriate pose for you. Gilly knew this was the next to last step in establishing her as the newest exhibit in the prince's collection. As she contorted her body at the demon's commands, her mind told her that it was now or never. It looks like Lena isn't going to make an 11th-hour rescue after all, she told herself, pushing through the disappointment to find another path. Her hand crept to the iron collar, giving it a yank out of desperation, but it yielded nothing. She closed her eyes, recalling Willa's words. The more you want out, the harder it will be to open. I don't want out, she told herself, focusing every atom of her energy on convincing herself of that truth. I want to stay in the iron forever and never escape. Just thinking the words wasn't enough to make the hidden latch on the collar open. Gilly wondered if she was misinterpreting Willa's words in a shot in the dark chance at freedom. But there was no room for doubt in her mind. She blanked it, then filled it with the image of the one thing that might make her a believer. She thought of Solomon, the handsome dev who'd brought her here, hoping he could clear away the part of her who longed for escape. In her mind, she spun the fantasy that they could be happy together with her in the collar, giving up her freedom as a sacrifice for their relationship. Gilly pictured his warm smile when she climbed into his arms in front of the fire in the evening. Imagining his comfortable sitting room, she saw herself resting her head on his broad shoulder, his arm around her, making her feel safe, making her feel whole. Her heart contracted, and Gilly realized that there truly was a part of her that wanted to sacrifice it all for Solomon. Although she knew a relationship between them was impossible, she poured all of her focus into the part of her that didn't care, the part of her that wanted Solomon above everything else. I could be happy with him, she told herself. Happy wearing this necklace for eternity if he was by my side. A smile crossed her face as she accepted that truth, knowing that staying in chains was at the same time setting her free. Gilly heard a click, and her eyes flew open. The iron collar slipped from her neck, and she jerked to catch it. The demons continued to debate her pose, the younger one wanting her in a highly stylized, highly acrobatic pose, while the older one held out for something simpler. While they argued, Gilly vaulted into a forward flip landing in front of the lava vent and dropping the iron collar inside it. She watched it disintegrate, a feeling of relief like she'd never experienced flowing over her. She turned back to face the attendants, a beatific grin on her face. Time to get out of here.
Chapter 24. The demons turned in her direction, the younger one holding up her hands enthusiastically.
See, look how talented she is. This is exactly the sort of thing we should be showcasing in her pose.
The older one shook her head, waving her hands dismissively.
She's just working off some excess energy, and I can't blame her, since she's about to spend eternity in a little glass box.
You see, that's where you're wrong, Gilly spoke up, cutting off their conversation. I'll be leaving now, and I advise you to let me go. Otherwise, I won't be responsible for what happens next. They looked at her, then collapsed into laughter once again. She ignored them, moving toward the entrance. Before her hand could touch the knob, the older demon appeared in front of her. Gilly stumbled backward, frowning. I thought teleportation was outlawed within the prince's domain.
Some of us have special privileges, dearie, she said, gripping Gilly's arm. I think we'll let the prince himself decide on the pose. Why don't we show you your new enclosure, yes?
No. Gilly extended her hands and touched the demon, channeling a pulse of power into her. The demon screamed and slammed into the door, sliding down it to lie in a puddle on the floor.
What did you do?
The other one screeched, running forward with the claws extended. With a wave of Gilly's hand, she was hit with a wall of air that pushed her back and into the cascade of water, leaving her choking underneath it. Gilly used her magic to open the door, then turned back to the women she'd left in shambles. Don't follow me, and don't raise the alarm, or I won't go so easily next time. They blinked up at her, cowering, and Gilly nodded, satisfied that they'd be too afraid to speak for long enough for her to effect an escape. Her magic seared her insides, and she could feel her skin starting to glow with the pure joy she was experiencing. She wanted to walk right up to the prince and let her magic explode all over him. The only thing keeping her from risking it was the memory of the supreme power she'd felt radiating off of him. He'd annihilate me without a second glance. Getting a hold of herself, Gilly forced herself to fade into the shadows. There were precious few in the keep, which surprised her, so she was forced to slink between torches in danger of being exposed. All I need is an exit. A part of her felt bad, putting flight at the top of her list. She'd vowed to free every creature in his horrific menagerie when she'd seen them arrayed in their suffering. But the reality was one Fae was no match for a demon army, Fae magic or not. I will leave now and return with an army powerful enough to topple this black spire and free every enslaved creature in this realm. This I promise. This I swear. Gilly slipped through a doorway into a darkened room, finding yet another chamber without window or chimney. Where does the smoke go? She asked herself, then realized she'd yet to see any fires blazing except for the one in the sitting room. With no chance of making it out the front door and past the row of demon guards on her own, she thought to make use of alternative means of egress. Except the keep had no windows that she could find, and so far only one chimney. The corridors were a maze of doors, and her attention to detail was lacking, so overwhelmed was Gilly with adrenaline. Creeping forward, she headed back in the direction of the sitting room, or so she hoped. She heard the clatter of dishes off one hallway, then smelled the aroma of fresh food. The kitchens were nearby, and whatever they were cooking was making her stomach growl. Ignoring her hunger pangs, she made her way past the hallway and veered left down another. A series of identical doors faced each other, and Gilly grabbed the knob on the closest to her, opening it a crack to peer inside. The walls of the room were splattered with blood, the smell overpowering Gilly and making her gag. A demon stood at a stone table with its back to her, a massive meat cleaver in one hand. The lump of meat and a fowl on the table before him was unrecognizable until her eyes lit on the creature's head. The bulging eyes of an amphibian swamp creature stared back at her above a row of nasty-looking teeth. Gilly closed the door as silently as she could, her stomach roiling. As good as the meat had smelled was directly correlated to how sick she felt now, knowing what was in the decadent-smelling dishes. I need to find the sitting room, not more horrors. She skipped the rest of the corridor, figuring the prince wouldn't keep his chamber so close to the butcher's. Turning the corner, she pressed herself into the shadows at the sound of a pair of demon guards heading in her direction. When they mentioned having to refill the prince's stash of liquor in his sitting room, Gilly set off following them, staying out of range to be detected, but close enough to follow their conversation. "Can't believe that dev's showing his face back here," the taller one grumbled. "Trying to ingratiate himself by bringing that light-loving female." "It's pure bribery, that is," the stouter one agreed.
The dev had their chance. The prince fashioned them first. Yeah, before he hit on a better model, the tall demon said, flexing his bicep. No wonder Ahriman made us after the dev failed him. He needed followers with fortitude and loyalty. Loyalty to the highest bidder, the other one said, as an aside, making them both crack up in laughter. They stopped before a door that revealed a storehouse. She crept inside after them, dissolving effortlessly into the shadowy chamber. While they found the crate full of alcohol the prince desired, Gilly checked the storage chamber for exits. But like every other room she'd come across, there were none. She did come across a crate with the symbol of an infant child marked in blood. Averting her eyes, she crouched in waiting until the demons marched past her carrying a 5-foot-long wooden crate with several amber-filled glass bottles inside. Tension was running high while she followed them back to the study where she hoped to find a chimney she could scale to escape the claustrophobic spire. Every second she strolled the hallways of the prince's keep was another second she could be caught. At long last they entered the study where Solomon and Ahriman had negotiated the cost of her body and soul for eternity. She hid herself in the space behind the open door and waited for them to refill the small wooden bar with its ration of amber liquid. They finally left, closing the door behind them and leaving Gilly on her own. A gas lamp burned in the corner, providing the only light. She was surprised to see that the fireplace was bare, not even a scrap of coal from the fire that burned earlier. Maybe they already swept it clean, she told herself, moving closer. Besides, this is better for you, as you won't have to compete against smoke and heat when you're scaling the chimney. Crouching, she poked her head into the chimney and promptly hit it against the stone wall just inside it. Moving to her back, Gilly stared up, a wide frown on her face at her discovery. There was no chimney. The fire was artificial, no doubt created by magic. Hope deserted her for a moment, and she crawled back out of the fireplace and stood, at a loss at what to do next. I have to try the main entrance, she realized. It's that or continue to search for another exit and risk being recaptured. Decision made, she peered out into the hallway, making sure it was empty before stepping out again. Consulting the hazy map in her head, Gilly attempted to trace her steps back to the entrance. When she passed the stone doors decorated in black diamonds, she knew she was close. Flattening herself to the wall at a corner, she waited for a pair of guards to pass the end of the hallway before heading down it. She took a step forward, then froze at the sensation of a hand on her shoulder. Gilly looked up and into a pair of dark eyes. Solomon's face was filled with surprise. "What are you doing loose?" he asked, his grip on her tightening. On instinct, Gilly sent a burst of power through her, jolting Solomon and making him drop her arm. His eyes flew to her neck, noticing immediately that the iron collar that had kept her weak had disappeared. "No, wait," he said. Then his eyes rolled back in his head when she hit him with high-voltage lightning. He dropped to the ground, stiff and smoking. Gilly sprinted down the hall, trying to put as much distance between them as she could. Her speed no longer encumbered by the iron, she raced down corridors a virtual blur. The dev, however, was hot on her heels. She heard the sound of rushing wind, then turned a corner to find a whirlwind of desert sand blocking her way. Solomon stepped out of the sands, his face dark. "How did you remove that collar?" he demanded. "And where has it gone?" "I destroyed it," she crowed, backing away from the charging figure. "Like I'm about to destroy you." Ice flew from her fingertips, blistering him with cold and covering the carpet beneath him with a slick sheen. While he flailed his way down the icy corridor, she turned back in the direction she'd come and put on a burst of speed. She reached the diamond-encrusted doors and wrenched them open, lurching into the audience chamber. Turning her attention to the dome above her, she considered how she might make it up there to smash the glass. There has to be a way out through there, she told herself. Gilly was halfway up the wall when the door slammed closed. She looked over her shoulder to see Solomon striding toward her. He lifted a hand toward her and started to chant in a language she didn't understand. Suddenly, the stones beneath her hands heated to an incredible temperature, and she was forced to drop to the floor below. "You cannot escape this place," he warned her, "and this reckless use of magic will just draw the prince right to you. I'm surprised he's not already here, pinning you down with whips of fire." "Is that what you wish would happen?" she growled at him. "You want to see me beaten, enslaved, brought low?" She circled him, waiting for another opportunity to attack. "Why? Because I intimidate you. It's nothing personal, Muchisa. It's what I have to do." "That's what you have to tell yourself to sleep at night, isn't it?" She scowled at him. "And what does that name even mean? You never bothered to tell me." Solomon tossed his head as if without care. "It's nothing. Perhaps you should bother to learn the language. And perhaps you should crawl back to the prince and beg his forgiveness for losing his most prized acquisition." Now that she was in possession of her full faculties, Gilly would not hesitate to let Solomon know how she really felt. "He wants me whipped and recaptured, and I want him to suffer." Rage rode her hard, rage prompted by outrage and a broken heart. While she'd been imagining a life built between them, he'd been cashing in for his own selfish designs. I meant nothing to him, and I still don't. She shoved her hands in her pockets to keep herself from throttling him. Her finger hit on something she'd forgotten, tucked in the folds of her pants pocket. She clutched it to determine its shape, then suppressed her gasp. The ring! She'd forgotten all about Phaedra's legend, having been so caught up in her multiple escape attempts. Now's the only opportunity I might get. I've got to try. Solomon launched himself at her, noticing that she was distracted. It was close, but she managed to throw herself out of range, rolling back to her feet with ease, then jumping onto his shoulders, locking her thighs around his head and using her body weight to jerk him to the ground. "You underestimate me," she said, grinning down at him. "That, or he doesn't want to damage the merchandise." The reason didn't matter to her, only the result. Her hands, crackling with energy, gripped his face, sending the bolts directly into his brain. Solomon let out a cry of anguish that pricked at her conscience, but Gilly ignored it. He lay there after, blinking, his mind disoriented, enough for her to place a small silver ring on his littlest finger. Leaning forward, she moved until her lips were only inches from his. "Solomon," she whispered, the dev's name sealing his doom. Solomon went rigid, his body shaking until it went still once again. Defeated, the dev lifted himself to his knees, bowing his head. "How can I serve you, mistress?" Chapter 25. Gilly was giddy at the results of her actions. She'd turned the tables entirely on the cocky dev, and he was now the one under her control. Deep inside, a small voice warned that she should tread carefully, but revenge made her deaf to the appeal. "You're my means of escape," she told him, patting him on the cheek. "You're going to help me get past the demons guarding the keep's gate?" Solomon hesitated, pure fury in his eyes as he stared up at her. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out except a few struggling noises. He shut it, then stood. "As you wish, mistress." Gilly's grin deepened. He has to do what I say, no matter how he feels about it. He can't even naysay me, can't even complain. This is the greatest moment of my life. There was a crash at the double doors, and they cracked open, a wave of liveried demons spilling in. Gilly was unsurprised, instead wondering how it had taken them so long to converge on her location. "It's time to go to work, pal," she told him, patting him on his shoulder. "I want you to take down those demons, now." Her command spoken, Solomon roared to life, transforming into his monstrous form without the pageantry of swirling sands this time. He threw himself into the first line of demons, slashing and biting, even ripping them apart with his bare hands. Despite his handiwork, the demons' numbers were too high, and Gilly had to put in some sweat of her own. She leapt onto the dais, then conjured a spout of flame that shot up to the ceiling to join in a rolling cloud of fire. Gilly brought her hands down, her fingers wiggling, and the flames began to rain from the ceiling on the screaming masses below. Backing up, she ran forward and leapt off the dais. She reached out, catching a demon by his horns and yanking him around. Using his own weight against him, she slammed the creature to the ground, knocking it out. Two demons beside him lunged for her, and she waited for them to come, ready to send a pulse of energy when they got close enough to touch. "I wish I had a bow," she told herself, thinking how quickly she'd fill the crowd of demons with arrows. An echoing roar came from the monstrous version of Solomon as he sped in her direction, his fury centered on the demons coming for her. Gilly made herself scarce, catching a torch sconce and pulling herself up to the ledge that ran along the stone wall. Perched there, she watched the battle from a distance. As always, Solomon was a fierce fighter. Any foe he came up against was bested, but the group of demons presented a challenge. From her place on the edge, Gilly could toss fireballs into the fray with ease. After 10 minutes, though, her energy began to wane. There were only a few demons left, and they fought sluggishly against the giant dev. He whirled around them with superior speed, using claw and tusk to rip and tear into their flesh and make them bleed. When he stood alone on a floor stained with blood, Solomon let out a roar of triumph. Gilly jumped down from the ledge and sauntered over to him. "Nice work," she said, patting him on the shoulder. His eyes burned into her, a mixture of emotion filling them. They stayed glued to her as his form shifted back. Solomon, back to his handsome, blood-soaked self, bowed his head again. "Whatever you plan to do, you best do it quickly, because there is no way the prince missed what just happened here." "You're going to help me escape both the keep and the prince's lands. You're going to put every iota of energy you have into getting me out of here unharmed. Do you understand?" "Yes," he replied simply. Gilly let out a deep breath. Although she knew the silver kept him under her command, she still could scarcely believe it. She'd bristled against his orders for days while they trekked across the wastelands. Being in charge of Solomon was something she was still getting used to. "Lead me to the main exit, but keep us out of sight if you can manage it." It turned out he could, and in a novel fashion, without hesitating, Solomon pulled her into his embrace. He closed his eyes and whispered a chant she couldn't make out. All of a sudden, she felt the whoosh of air and sand beside her. "I'm inside the whirlwind." It spun itself, filling the space, but she and Solomon remained still inside it. The dev piloted the miniature sandstorm out through the tall doors and down a plushly carpeted hallway. The whirlwind zipped down corridors, finally ending at the gates to the keep. The wind dissipated and the sand vanished. Gilly carefully stepped forward, wearing an expression filled with confusion. "Where is everyone?" "Maybe they were the ones we fought in the audience chamber," Solomon ventured. But by the look on his face, she could tell he didn't quite believe that himself. "Could it be a trap?" she whispered, then slid forward to peek out at the gates, which were standing open. "Could the prince and his forces be waiting just outside to ambush us?" Solomon took a deep breath. "Only one way to find out." The dev marched out of the gate alone, ready to face whatever awaited them outside. Gilly was overwhelmed with admiration for his bravery. She jogged after him, joining him to stare across the flat expanse of the valley. "There's no one out here," she said, scratching her head in genuine bewilderment. "Let's take it as a blessing," Solomon said, "as rare as they are here." He set off in the direction of the ridge they'd scaled to reach the keep. "Perhaps we can make it back into the swamps before the prince realizes we're gone." "What do you think is keeping him?" Gilly asked as she fell into step beside him. They were running, not quite at top speed, but faster than most other creatures could travel. The wind pushed back her hair, and she was filled with a moment of wild abandon, the joy of her freedom making her chest feel light enough to allow her to take flight. "I cannot say," Solomon said, his expression bleak, "but I have never met anyone stronger than Prince Araban. I cannot believe he will let us escape, especially you. He is planning for you to be the cornerstone of his collection." Gilly grimaced at his words. "And I'm planning for his head to decorate my mantle," she spat back, making Solomon laugh in spite of himself. "You're ferocious when your powers are at your disposal," he admitted, "and fast." "Oh yeah?" she asked, liking the notion that he was impressed with her. "Just watch this." Gilly put on a burst of speed, outpacing him with ease and leaping onto the rock ledge that led to the ridge. She made quick work of the clay creatures who appeared as the last line of defense, kicking them gleefully off the ridge and watching as Solomon brought his foot down on each one he encountered. Solomon was hot on her tail, she discovered as she began to climb in earnest, and she found herself competing with him, working to climb faster, to reach the top before him. She managed to be the first one standing on the top of the ridge, but just barely. Her chest was heaving as she struggled to catch her breath, but she was buoyed to find that her companion was just as winded. It didn't stop him from smiling in her direction before he turned to look back at the keep. The joy went out of him, and a grim expression took up residence on his handsome features. "Free me," he said softly, turning to her. "Free yourself," she said flippantly, a frizzle of anger returning. I cannot even touch the ring with another finger or any other instrument. Unless you pull it from my finger, I will remain under your sway." "It only seems fair to me," she shot back. "You've been bossing me around for ages now. It's time to see what it feels like to be helpless, to be dependent on another for everything you need." "You were doing this out of spite," he said plainly, although she could tell he had a few other choice words for her that the silver would not allow him to express. "And you were about to doom me to an eternity spent as a butterfly on a pin," she reminded him. Shame entered his face then, and Gilly felt a shock of emotion at its presence. He struggled for a moment, then opened his mouth to speak before closing it again. Pain filled his features, and she wanted to know what he was thinking. Would he risk an apology, knowing she'd consider it fake in the face of their situation? Instead, he kept quiet. Turning his back on the keep, he started down the opposite side of the ridge toward the swamp that lay below it. Gilly followed, feeling like an opportunity had been missed. Then it came, what they'd expected. An intense roar rent the night, shaking the rock face and causing pebbles to tumble down into darkness. "That's him," Solomon said, swallowing hard. "That's the prince. He's coming for us." "Then let's make certain we're ready for him. Come on." Gilly scrambled down the ridge, knowing they would have a better chance of surviving if they reached the marshlands. More places to hide, she thought, refusing to let the fear that was dogging her steps take over her mind. The prince may be powerful, but no being is invincible. With a look behind her at the worried face of her companion, Gilly prepared herself to fight. Epilogue. The crack of the whip was followed by a stinging blow. Shirk gritted his teeth, feeling the sting of the lash over and over until his back was bloodied and his spirit nearly broken. He knew the blows were a punishment, but he wasn't sure what he was being punished for, other than being born a second son. At this moment, while his youngest son was being whipped in the main courtyard of their keep for crimes uncommitted, his father lay on his deathbed. The old man was stubborn, and he'd lingered, refusing to give up the ghost and die with dignity. Instead, he clung to life like a babe clinging to a breast, and Shirk clung with him. His father was too sick to rule, too sick to protect his second son from his first. 4 years before Shirk was Shirk, he'd benefited from his father's beneficence and his mother's kindness. But now his father was dying, and his mother was already in the ground, food for worms and grubs and no longer a hand to hold when the nightmares came. When his father died, Shirk knew his older brother would kill him. It would be cruel, and it would be painful, and his brother would gobble up the holdings that were to be Shirk's. It was only a matter of time before the chain of events was put in motion. All it needed was his father's last breath. The old man had split his holdings, dividing them equally between his 2 sons, but Shirk knew his brother wanted it all. There was no love lost between them, his older brother having hated him since the moment he took his first breath. His brother's own mother had died when he was still a boy, leaving him with a shriveled heart because no one had taught him how to use it. His father had remarried, and a few years later Shirk had come along. Only he wasn't called Shirk then. Shirk was the name his brother had given him, the one he now commanded everyone to use on pain of public lashing. When Shirk was born, his brother was nearly a man grown, and he had no patience for another male heir to what he considered his sole birthright. Now, on the eve of their father's death, Shirk had seen 12 revolutions, just barely reaching his majority. His brother, on the other hand, had already swung the army to his cause, demanding personal loyalty after his father's death in exchange for coin. Shirk didn't have an army. He didn't even have a mother any longer. She died last year after his father had fallen sick with the wasting disease that was still devouring him from the inside. They'd ruled it an accident, saying she'd fallen down the stairs in the dead of night and broken her neck. Shirk had seen the body sneaking into the outbuilding where they were preparing her for burial. The look in her eyes had paralyzed him, the fear there so stark and real. That look had haunted him as grief had haunted him, and Shirk wasn't certain he could ever recover from a loss so profound. Soon he would be there to join her, he told himself, gritting through the last of the lashes. Shirk might even welcome death. He'd been tortured by his brother for so long. Death might provide the solace he needed. And he could see her again, his mother. Shirk knew she was waiting for him on the other side of the river, her shade unsettled until she could hold her boy in her arms again. His brother had tortured him for as long as Shirk could remember. He used to hide it, finding ways to hurt him without leaving noticeable marks, but now that their father was dying, he didn't bother anymore. With impunity, he commanded daily torture sessions meant merely to torment the brother he resented. The lashes finished. Shirk was released from the chains, holding his body up for the lash. 2 of his brother's loyal soldiers dragged him across the courtyard and into the stables, where a bath had been prepared for him. It was not a soothing warm water soak that Shirk expected. He knew what awaited him and prepared to bear it as stoically as he could. He knew that soon it would be over, this miserable life of his, and he had few experiences left, even horrible ones. The soldiers deposited him in a tub with more salt than water in it, his wounds crying out the moment he touched the mixture. The cuts from the lash burning, he used his time in the cleansing purgatory of the salt bath to plot his escape. There was no doubt in his mind that his brother would kill him the moment their father expired, and although he was eager to be reunited with his mother, he could not commit to seeing her so soon. A fire burned inside him, a secret flame that he'd fed his resentments and slights into for years. It burned brighter than ever now, a raging fire called revenge. Shirk would not give up the ghost himself, not until he could see his brother laid low and claim that which should be his. Shirk knew the realm was a perilous place, but remaining here in his father's keep was no less dangerous. He would rather face the dangers of the realm alone than to continue to wait for his brother to kill him. Shirk told himself that he would escape. He would find his fortune, build his strength, and one day he would return for his revenge. One day Shirk knew he would be a force to be reckoned with, if he could just survive long enough to reclaim what was his. The end.